So welcome back. We're going to give it a few more minutes to see that our other colleagues get in and are able to activate their audio and their cameras. And again, we'll give it just another moment or two for our other colleagues to join us, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And I'll just refresh your memories, because you'll have a moment or two, that I did ask you to look at the different models of supervision and to identify something that you felt drawn to or an alignment with, and something that felt very opposite to you. So if you recall that I asked you to do that, give me like a wave, a thumbs up, throw money. Okay, excellent, good, excellent, good. So I'm getting physical and electronic thumbs up. Fantastic, great. All right, so folks, I think we should go ahead and officially start, because what I can assure you is we will officially conclude at 1 o'clock. I want to thank Megan for starting us off wonderfully by sending a message that Megan will be right back. So that same guideline, if you need to step away for a moment, just let us know that. And if you are able to, please activate your camera and be on camera for the full conversation. And I'll just underline that it is hoped that this will be a learning community conversation, that we will be able to interact with each other and talk with each other and share our thoughts, our experience, our understanding of this particular material, which leads to one of our other guidelines, which is, of course, we want to be intentional and aware of the language we're using as we talk with each other. And we also want to speak from the I. We want to make I statements. I will throw out one other thing. Dr. Blackwell and I talked about this, and I will repeat, I guess now for the third time for anybody who just joined us, that Dr. Blackwell will be with us today. She'll be joining us maybe a little bit before 10 or at 10. And she'll be with us from 10 to 1 till the conclusion of the day. But thanks, Astrid. Dr. Blackwell and I were talking in preparation for today. And one of the things we also wanted to acknowledge is that there is a tremendous amount of experience and expertise in our learning community, and people have a lot to say, and that's fantastic. And we also just want to underline that there may be moments during our conversation where we may need to say, okay, we need to kind of cut off the discussion so that we can move a little bit forward with the content. So we just wanted to share that with you, that unfortunately we may not be able to hear from everybody all the time, but we'll do our best to make space and also balance sharing the content as well. So we just wanted to kind of put that on the table as a guideline too. Can everybody agree to those guidelines? Yeah? Okay. Okay, fantastic. And you know, I'll put it to you this way. If there's something that you really want to say and you want to make sure that it gets said, you're more than welcome to sort of be like, no, I really do want to say this. And, you know, we will do our best to respect that. And this group is very skilled and comfortable with using the chat. So please also feel free to continue to use the chat to share your perspective and your ideas as well. Okay. Let's open it up. And I'm wondering, Nico, if we could start with you. Any thoughts or any reactions or any comments or questions about our first day together? Anything unresolved or anything in particular that stands out to you from our first day together? And if you're willing to unmute and kind of start us off, that would be great. And then we can let a couple of other people comment on that as well. But any thoughts or any reactions about our first day?
Yeah, I just I want to say, to further your point, that we have a lot of people with a lot of experience here in the group. I heard some stuff in our last training that really opened my eyes. Not in like like, oh, it changed my life, but I mean, like, oh, my eyes open up, like, oh, I'm listening now, so I thought that was really cool because I wasn't expecting people to really be so articulate or share so much or actually get so philosophical. So I thought that was pretty cool. It opened my eyes, opened my ears, whatever the expression is. So that's
Fantastic.
that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Nico. Yes, please go ahead. I see that go ahead. Yeah. Hi. Good
Yeah,
morning.
I just wanted to say good morning. I
Welcome
just
back.
wanted to say too, I was actually like, just to be completely honest, when I first was like taking this, I was like, oh, I have to take this class. I'm like not looking forward to it because a lot of the trainings I've been in recently have just not hit the mark. But after about an hour of sitting with everybody in here and the instructors, I was excited and I was actually like listening and learning, and I was actually really excited to come back today. So I just wanted to like say that I think that it really goes to the point that you're saying, is that when everybody's like sharing and like also just the language people are using and the instructors' MI skills, like I've been enjoying it and I'm looking forward to the next two.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you could, would you please confirm, as I often ask, that I have not spoken to you since last time, nor did Dr. Blackwell or I pay you to say what you just said?
No, I actually was bragging on you all to my supervisor, and actually I guess my supervisor's known you for like a few decades, but
Okay.
because she was like, oh, is it da da da, and I was like, yeah. But I was very impressed, especially with the way that you all treated us. Sometimes we don't experience that with trainers, especially like a trainer who has a doctorate. Like I've experienced before, kind of more like people maybe talking down or not asking permission as much. Like it was a very pleasant experience and I'm looking forward to more.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sharaya. Thank you. Did I pronounce it correctly? Good. Jared, any thoughts, any reactions from last time?
No, kind of echoing Shirai in a sense. I mean, like I said, as weird as it sounds, this was my first Zoom meeting, for over the pandemic. So it was kind of getting used to this whole dynamic. I've been to a lot of obviously other meetings, but this was my first Zoom one. So learning how that works and kind of the input from everyone and everything. It was definitely a good first one. I was looking forward to the second one. So I'm excited for this one. That's what I would say.
Super. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
And yeah. And maybe before we kind of make a transition into the sort of mini activity that I asked you to do, maybe Dion, if you would be willing, if you would like to have the last word, any thoughts or any reactions from last time? I understand that Joyce is having some technical problems. Thanks for letting me know, Joyce. Dion, anything that you would say about last time, or thoughts or reactions you had?
I'm always cautious because there's two Dions. So
I'm sorry. So Dion Greenhill,
Okay.
and then to be fair, we should go to the other Dion as well, because we want to let Dions have their moment. But go ahead, Dion Greenhill, and then we'll go to the other Dion.
I definitely liked the breakout sessions because it was a mix of people who didn't have as much seasoned experience as other supervisors, or those who didn't have supervisory experience at all. I found it to be quite interesting, evoking. So I really enjoyed that. And as everybody else has echoed, there's so much information that can be gleaned through these sessions. So I really appreciate it. But one comical thing was I couldn't wait to get out of the session so I could just go and purchase some pizza, because that was on my mind throughout the whole thing.
We probably should have started with a poll of how many people ate pizza. And that is not a segue into that we're going to be talking about food at this particular moment. So when is it 1 o'clock yet? I got to go get that pizza. Yes. And Dion Bird, the floor is yours if there's anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to say. I can see your elbow and your hands. Excellent. Very good.
So hi, everyone.
Hi.
So I'm all new to this and I'm enjoying every moment of it. I don't know a lot, so I'm just learning and I'm listening. And after this session, I went home and went through and read some of the modules, clinical supervision modules.
Okay.
So I'm just here, I'm learning and I'm enjoying the time and see how much I can learn and absorb and use in the future, because no one knows what the future holds.
Truly. Yes. Thank you so much, Dion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So folks, you know, Dion Bird has really, again, helped us to make kind of a transition into this idea of these different methods of clinical supervision. Now, again, the little activity that I asked you to engage in was to review those methods, to briefly review them, and identify something that you felt was from a particular model that you felt particularly drawn to, and something that was from a particular model that maybe you didn't feel that drawn to. So whomever wants to unmute and start us off with that is more than welcome to do that. I will add one thing though before that person unmutes and sort of starts us off, which is, remember, this whole segment is about the process of the development of your own personal model of supervision, which means that you may draw from some of these models or you may not. And that through your experience and through your interactions with your supervisees, you will be developing and creating the way you conduct clinical supervision. And that you will probably adjust your model based on the needs of any particular supervisee that you may be working with. So the reason that we share these models with you is because we want you to know that models exist, they are guides, and that ultimately we incorporate and use from these existing guides what serves us. So having said that, who'd like to start us off? Something that you saw in it? Yeah, go ahead, Megan, please. Yeah, so something that you saw in the model, what the model was that you liked, and then perhaps the same model or another model, something that you weren't really that drawn to.
So good morning, everybody. I kind of like the CBT supervision model. One, because to me, it's kind of like you're building a rapport between the supervisor and the supervisee.
Right.
And it's kind of like, I think like it's all structured, you know, includes like the trainees to actually like summarize on what's going on in the session and to agree on certain homework assignments and actually had feedback of what's going on in the session.
So Megan, you like the structure as well as the collaborative partnership and the input that the supervisee gives.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And what about something in a model that you saw that you didn't feel particularly drawn to?
To be honest, I didn't really see anything wrong with this model because I do like a lot of CBT with a lot of the clients in here, and my supervisor has used that with me over the years as I've been a counselor.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense, and you know, CBT is what is mostly everybody using in the therapeutic world right now.
Okay.
Other than just person-centered therapy.
Understood. And Megan, thank you so much for starting us off and for being so specific. And again, keep in mind, Megan is talking about a therapeutic model of clinical supervision, right, Megan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Who else? Yeah, go ahead, Christina, please.
So the model I identify with the most, and I love, and I didn't even know that it was that we could utilize that in clinical supervision, is the psychodynamic model. Because I believe that it all starts with self-awareness, right? We are helping our clients become self-aware, but how can we not be? and it addresses really important issues like transference and countertransference, and help us understand our own reactions to the client and where it comes from. I think that's so essential when we're trying to, not the client, the counselor, whoever we're supervising.
Yeah.
The one I had the most difficulty with, that I didn't even know that it was an approach that we could utilize, is the feminist model. The thing, so I wouldn't even know how to go about it. And especially, I think it's challenging, especially with all, I'm really careful with all the sensitivity around gender roles. I think that that's something I wouldn't want to step in, just to be careful. So I see that as, and I would think, how is that really going to help in supervision? So I have a lot of questions about that one. I was looking into it. Yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Christina, could I ask you just a quick follow-up question?
Sure. Yes.
When you started with the enthusiasm you started about the psychodynamic model, you said, I love this model. And I'm very curious, what about that model feels so right for you?
One of the models that I utilize with the patients already. Yeah, so I have a lot of experience with psychodynamic therapy, but it's, like I said, it's about self-awareness for me, because we impact other people. We impact the clients, our own biases, our formation, our past, and these transfers and countertransference issues, we need to be aware of them and how we can impact other people, including those who we supervise. These are things that are actually even more difficult to resolve or address than even CBT. Because with CBT, we have more awareness, but with psychodynamic, it's about becoming self-aware.
Yes, and it's also about acknowledging that there's an unconscious that we may not, quote unquote, hence the name, unconscious. We're not conscious about it, and it's at play. Yeah. And, you know, Christina, I want to connect what you're saying to what Megan said earlier, because you both indicated models that you have experience with too. So there's an affinity. It's something you're already using that you're drawn to as well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Danielle, I see your hand is raised.
Good morning, everybody. So it's interesting that you say that, because as folks are speaking, I'm thinking of identifying what I currently use, which is typically more solution focused, because a lot of times I currently supervise peer advocates. So it's a lot about celebrating small successes. Not that we certainly identify issues around transference and countertransference and things like that come up.
Yep.
It's interesting because the one that I least like is sort of the family therapy model, because I don't necessarily, again, I want to address those types of things. I think if you're going, for me, if I'm going that far into it, that's the point at which I would ask my supervisee, like, do you go to therapy? Is that something you're interested in? Can I refer you to EAP? Because it seems like there might be larger, like a sort of a boundary of like, am I providing supervision or am I providing therapy? I know sometimes you go a little deeper in supervision, but the other thing that is interesting that when CBT was mentioned, what I thought I heard you say was that, as you're developing rapport, and I think I'm wondering if I'm using the model I'm using because I already have that rapport. So I already know them really well. I already know, their wife's names, their children's names, etc. So we've already sort of, beyond that, I'm working on sort of honing in and developing skills and helping them to, again, I always say all the time, celebrate small successes, because a lot of times in this work, you get discouraged if folks have a recurrence of use or, things like that, and really to celebrate the work that you're doing and the small steps along the way. So that's what I've got out of the conversation so far. Thank you.
Okay, Danielle, would it be okay if I made a little observation in terms of what you're saying?
Sure.
It's interesting because you did make that distinction of these are folks that I already have rapport with. And you also talked specifically about like helping them with their professional development. And it's almost like a competency-based model where you're identifying particular competencies or skills that when they achieve success with that, you really want to be able to celebrate and acknowledge, hey, you've picked this particular skill up, you're now doing it.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that a fair understanding of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So again, this idea, there's, you know, these competency-based models of supervision, and there's a blend because I imagine there's a psychodynamic component to it as well. Thank you so much, Danielle.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Let's go to Sincere. Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll go to Lisa.
Everybody. Good morning. First of all, I'm excited. I'm just to be here again. There's so much to learn, and I didn't realize how many different models there were. This is my first time learning about supervision in a sense. But one of the focus and models that I would like to focus on is, of course, competency-based. And the model in particular is discrimination, which I thought was odd to call it that for some reason. But what I like about it is that it focused on the needs. And one of the things as a supervisor, because I think supervision is supposed to help promote the field, keep the integrity of the field, and protect the patient. You know, and so once you're able to horn into those skills as a supervisor for the supervisee and instruct them and help them, it's going to make for a better promotion of the field, because there's so much abuse within the field.
Yeah.
Not just towards patients, but also towards supervisors and supervisees. So it's about the integrity of the field. But I like the focus on needs, current knowledge, expanding that. And I like the fact that as a role of the supervisor, it's, you know, teaching, consulting, you know, providing that. And I just enjoyed it. And I'm learning too about motivational interviewing too. But I had a quick question. Why was it that they did not consider really motivational interviewing like one of the models originally?
Well, again, it is considered one of the therapeutic models.
Yes.
And I think it's because it's a method of communication about behavior change. And to me, it would make complete sense that you'd think about it in supervision. And I'm thinking of what Danielle said about a particular competency. Because let's say you have a supervisee who wants to develop, and since Megan brought this up, let's say the supervisee wants to be able to be effective at the use of cognitive behavioral therapy with their patients. And that's a particular competency that they want to develop. Well, that is probably going to involve them engaging the clinician, engaging in some sort of behavior change in terms of how they're interacting with clients, and using an MI form of supervision, an MI approach to supervision, which again would be a therapeutic model of supervision, to me would make perfect sense. So to be honest, I don't really have an answer as to why it wasn't originally thought of as a supervisory model. I think partly because it wasn't conceived that way. You know, MI was Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick developed motivational interviewing, and Bill Miller did the original research on it, basically in conversations with folks who were considered problem drinkers. So it really was about helping people to change, patients to change a particular behavior. And why couldn't it be brought into a supervisory conversation? Because it's a behavior change conversation. So it kind of came after what the initial purpose was. And I would venture, and I'm not an expert in CBT, but I would venture CBT wasn't originally developed as a supervisory model either. Sort of parallel to MI. So no hard and fast answer there.
Thank you, though.
You're very welcome, and thanks for the question. Was there any model that you were particularly not, or aspect of a model that you were not really drawn to?
It would be the feminist model.
Yeah, as Christina said, yeah.
Yes. There just seems to be so many different ways to look at it. And I wasn't really sure why the main purpose of that model. I just wasn't attracted to that.
Understood. And again, folks, we can think of these models as lenses of how to view a particular situation. And some of the lenses are going to resonate with us more than others. Yeah. Thank you so much. Lisa. Yeah.
I'll start with what I didn't like first. And
Okay.
I'm a little shocked because I'm coming from leadership in the business world, where I would focus on the competency-based type models and building competencies and just teaching people how to do the thing. And in this field, I find that it's probably like, well, it's still useful. It's probably like the least useful lens, because there's so many other aspects of things that you have to, and like, again, the lenses that you have to look through in this field and incorporate. There's issues of transference, there's issues of bringing your own issues in, there's you know, I think I would love the feminist model in business because it's a very different dynamic, where in this field it's very you know, there's a majority of women and in this field and stuff like that. So I think it's, you know, different things for different needs. I think that's why I kind of like the blended model, because you can take the best of everything and kind of, you know, work with what you need to do. I like having a really large toolbox of tools, because again, everybody's different, every situation is different, every client is different, so you have to help coach your counselors to you know, see a perspective that, you know, you might, or they might not have seen, and see things through a lens that they might not have used before. So if you have that lens, that's a good tool to show them.
Okay. So just so I'm clear, we started with the model that you're not most comfortable with would have been the competency model.
Yeah, in this field, which is,
and
weird,
that surprises
again, that's
you.
what I that's what I used to do when I was in leadership in business and managing you know, marketing director of a software company. I, you know, was teaching people based on their skills and you know, encouraging people to grow their skill set. And it was so less tied to everything else going on around them. It was just what they're able to do in their output versus like the whole person.
Right. Yes. And again, you're making the argument of why it can be helpful in this field, which is different, that we have to consider the whole person, because it's the supervisee that's the vehicle through which the service is provided. It's not just whether they can practice CBT or not. It's the whole person. And Lisa, just so I'm clear and I make sure that I understood you, the piece that you liked was the idea of a blended model, because you can have a larger toolkit and you can draw on a lens as needed depending on the supervisee in front of you.
Yeah, I like, you know, learning a little bit of everything and pulling from what you need.
Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure I was on the same page with you. Jared, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I agree with Elisa when I was reading through kind of that blended model. I think I was attracted to because in doing outpatient with addictions, you know, that model, you know, not having a name for it at the time, was beneficial when I was reading through of how I approached my clients and outpatient, and counseling with addictions.
Okay.
So kind of being gravitating towards that, I could see how that would benefit from a supervision standpoint of kind of having, the individualized approach, approaching people kind of where they're at, and working on those individual goals as opposed to kind of like a, blanket approach of approaching everyone the same. So in reading through that, it was all stuff that I had used in the past. So kind of going off those skills and using those from with supervisees, I think would be beneficial. I, definitely gravitated towards that.
Okay. And Jared, if it's okay, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So similar to what some of the other folks in the learning community have said, because you had the experience as a provider interacting with patients in a particular way, you're drawn to want to share and bring that particular lens to the supervisory conversation as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. It made sense of, okay, I approached patients this way and found the benefit in it. And, you can do the same thing with, the supervisees approaching, with that model, using those same skills, to help further your supervisees.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yep.
Yvette, I see that your hand is raised, and then I see Yuban, your hand is raised too. So we'll go to Yvette and then we'll go to Yuban.
Good morning, everyone. So being in the field for such a long time, you've seen it all, you've done it all. And I think that the reason why I chose something different is because we use CBT so much that sometimes it can become a little jarred,
Okay.
I think it blocks the empathy level for the individual providing the service, because you've seen it, done it, did it, and this is this model and we use this. And although, you want the best for the consumers that you serve, and in the supervisory role, when they come in, it's this meeting thing, it's exchange, and so that was the one I didn't like. The one I kind of honed to, and I found something new, was the 7-eyed supervision model. And the reason why is because it has such a questionnaire. It questions you as the provider, it questions you as the supervisor, it questions you as what your thoughts was as any interaction that you have with anyone. So perfect example, it says, as far as it focuses on the client. The I1 focuses on the client. I2 focuses on intervention. I3 focuses on the client relationship, the client therapist relationship. I4 focuses on the therapist's process. I5 focuses on the therapist supervisor relationship. I6 focuses on supervisor's process, and I7 focuses on the wider content. But I just wanted to say, for the focus on the client, it says, how did they come into the room? How did they sit? How did they hold themselves? How do they talk? What might be their perception of you? And so it asks all of these dynamic questions that I have lost sight of from doing the day-to-day. And so it's something different, because like the participants before me, how they were sharing, you lose perspective when using a certain model. It kind of hones you away and you go into just a process of work, and so that was one of the things. And I wanted to get back into the fold of having empathy and the directness with the clients and with the people that I supervise. So that's why I chose that model.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, you said something that I find really intriguing, which is that as supervisors, we have to consider, are we over relying on a particular lens?
Love that.
Because we're so familiar with it.
Yeah.
And is there something, are there things that we could be missing because we've grown so accustomed to a particular way of working?
Yes.
Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying it. Yeah.
No, thank you. And I love the fact that you're raising that question, because there are things that we're going to be just naturally drawn to because of who we are, because of our experience. And the question we can always be asking ourselves is, and again, I love the way you put this, are there things we're missing because we've been so caught up in the way we're used to doing things?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's why I think this learning community conversation is valuable, because we're kind of all entertaining, well, are there other ways to see this situation or this supervisee? And are there other things, and I'm going back to Lisa's very large toolbox, are there other things from our large toolbox that we could potentially employ to work with this particular supervisee?
And Paul, you know, when I first came into the field many years ago, I wanted to save everybody. I wanted to save the supervisors. I wanted to save the consumers, you know, and I wanted this approach to be so effective. But day to day, and as years grow, you know, you just simply want to get through the day, just be the best person that you could be, and follow the guidelines of the agency that you serve, you know, and the consumers that you serve. And so it has got so day to day, like so redundant, that you do the same thing over and over again, and it lost the volume for it. And so I'm trying to get back into the fold again, you know, and just, I think that because my interaction is minimal with the clients, and once the promotion came, I kind of got removed from that piece of it. So just seeing the fiscal responsibility and, you know, all the redundant paperwork, and, you know, you only see them on the paper. You don't see them because you're not interviewing them anymore. You know what I mean? When you see, you hear the situations, you hear about it in the meetings, but you don't actually have that connection with them anymore. So that's, I think that I'm saying, I don't have that connection anymore, you know, and I need to have that. So just trying to put that back into the fold.
Thank you. And, you know, I will just add that you make a very powerful case for how supervision and us being supervisors can actually keep us fresh and vital in the field. Because if we're willing to really collaborate and partner with our supervisees and pull from whatever tools are necessary or whatever lens is necessary to achieve what we want to achieve with that supervisee, that gives us an opportunity to continue to learn and grow.
Exactly, because like I said before, there would be times where I would go in and sit in on a group or do those things, but because of all of the paperwork and that I use as excuse, you know, just trying to get through the day, I'm not interacting as much as I used to. And so then when the supervisions come, it's like, you know, okay, well, let's follow this and this and this and this, you know, instead of actually getting to, or I only intervene if there's an issue between my supervisee and then I'm trying to resolve that to the best possible, you know. So it's just like, I just need to get back into the fold again. So
understood.
This is great to hear the perspectives of others. So I'm just grateful for that. And thank you for letting me share.
Oh, you're welcome, Yvette. Yuban, what were you going to add? And then Max, I see you.
So I wasn't sure whether I was the only person who couldn't really pick one favorite model. I really loved all of it. And I'm like, well, I like this one. I like that one. I like that one. I was like, oh my God, that's everything. So it's like, you know, a lot of times we do use all of them. And, you know, I don't know whether I'm indecisive, but I could not pick one that I liked the most. So that's what I wanted to say.
What do you take away from the supervisory training? Well, I like all the models.
I know.
But there's nothing wrong with that.
I really do like all of them, and I do use them all in one of my supervision, because, you know, I have this one person who's struggling. So I was like, I used CBT model one day, and I was like, okay, that didn't work. Then next week, I was like, okay, I'll use motivational model. So it's like, you know, I use all of them, and so I couldn't pick one.
Yeah, and you know, Yuban, you just said something that is so important to underline, which is when we have the opportunity to sit across from or be across a screen from a supervisee, we do our best effort. We make our best choice to try and provide supervision for that person in that moment. And we may realize upon reflection, you know, that particular lens just didn't work for that person. And now I need to go back to the toolbox. I need to adjust. I need to rethink what's the best model and maybe what's the best modality for this person. And we're going to talk about modalities a little bit later today, but what's the best informed model? And you know, that model may change for that person depending on what, and you said, the person is struggling with something, depending on what that person is focusing on, what's the focus of their supervision at that particular time. A particular model may be warranted for that person because of that moment as well. So it really does make the case for how flexible and attuned we need to be to what's going on with a particular supervisee at any given moment in their process. So you liked every model, and was there any one that you liked a little less?
Hard to choose.
Hard to choose. Okay, all right.
I had to go with family. If I had to choose one, like if you're making me choose one, I would to go with the family. Some odd reason, family model is not appealing at this point.
Okay. Yeah. And again, folks, there's no right or wrong answer here. I was asking you to really look at it from your perspective, what you felt yourself drawn to and what you didn't feel yourself drawn to. And Christina, you may think, you know, that's kind of a psychodynamic approach that Paul is using there. And it is, because ultimately you will be providing these particular supervisory conversations or interventions. Thank you so much, Yuban. Max, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to Joyce. Max is unmuting.
Sorry, my computer's weird.
No problem.
Yeah, I think the model that I feel the most drawn to is like blended or integrated. Sorry, I'm gonna stop my video so it stops seizuring.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that it felt the most like relationship based and based on what the individual person that you're interacting with might need, instead of trying to take like a preset criteria or formula or like model and then fit that person into it. It was more like just like allowing it to fit the nuances and identities and the skill sets and the cultural backgrounds. And like, I like an approach that really considers the person like in their entirety.
Yeah.
And I think like a lot of people have said that like bits of all of them seemed really useful. And the one thing that I really don't like is role playing, so like the part of the competency model. I just think that it's useless and horrible and anxiety provoking, and like
I think
like
Jared agrees with you.
It's like, yeah, if I have a supervisor who's like, okay, Max, I'm going to be your client and role play what you would do in this scenario. Like, I'm not role playing what I'm going to do in that scenario. I'm like just doing the things that I think you want me to do. It's impossible for me to like be authentic while I'm being watched and like know that I'm being, you know, like, what's the word?
Evaluated
like,
or assessed.
Like that like in itself makes it impossible for me to actually role play and play like, it's like when you make people take tests, they've done a lot of studies that show you're not actually testing their knowledge, you're testing their test taking ability. You can have somebody who knows 100% of the answers, but is really terrible at taking tests and they get them all wrong. And you can have somebody who doesn't know it at all, but is really good at taking tests and scores really high. And it just, I hate it so much. So I would never use that with anybody that I was supervising.
Max, can I share some very disturbing and shocking news with you today about today? Max is like, yeah, go ahead, lay it on me. We are actually going to have an opportunity for role playing later on today. and I want to thank you so much for saying what you said, because so many people feel that way. And you know something, if I had the great opportunity to be providing supervision to Max, I would want to know that. I would want to know that because I would know that role play is not the way, it's not the way to work with Max as my supervisee. So, you know, I can't thank you enough, Max, for putting that on the table, because it keeps it very real. Supervisees have strong reactions. They have particular preferences, just like we might. So I really value so much that you were able to really tease out the nuance of, like, look, if you're my supervisor and you're telling me to role play, I'm not really being authentic. I'm just doing what I think you want me to do. And that's important to know. And, you know, when we get to this part where there will be hopefully there'll be some role playing, we'll see if there's any value in that within the context of our learning community as well. Because there may or may not be. You know, the beauty of this particular course, and I love about our learning community conversation, is you're drawing from it what is going to support what you do. And the things that don't do that, you can leave behind. Joyce, what would you say? What are your thoughts? And then we'll go to Carol.
I was attracted to the integrated model myself, and I'll tell you why. Because from the beginning of my entry into the field, I've always thought that I wanted to be use supervisory in an eclectic manner, even with patients as well as with supervisees, simply because people change in the moment. You know, and I was looking at the trans-theoretical, and you know, you have the patient who is in contemplation, you know, maintenance, whatever, and then some of the counselors, some people who you're supervising, they're just coming into the field themselves from recovery, actively in recovery, and they're recovering, so they're going through these stages as well. And we have to take a look at that. You know, what I was least attracted to also was family, because I'm not here to work with you about your family. You have to take that elsewhere. I'm here specifically to work with you through and to work with patients so that they get the services that are needed. You know, and I connected with you immediately. You know, immediately, because that's what I think, you know. So I was definitely integrated in what I thought best for me as a supervisor, and family was not the interest for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And you know, Joyce, you and somebody else, and I'm not recalling who at this particular moment, but somebody else and you both have just made this connection to the distinction. And maybe after we hear from Carol, we can start to conclude this conversation with the idea that, and I'd like everybody to consider this, that what is the difference between supervision and therapy? Because remember, we're talking about clinical supervision. And I'd like everybody to kind of ponder that for a minute. But let's hear from Carol, and then we'll talk a little bit about that question, because Joyce, you and somebody else kind of raised that. Go ahead, Carol. What are your thoughts about what you were going to say?
Oh, I kind of just shifted after that last statement.
Oh, well, then consider my statement retracted for the moment. Go ahead.
I appreciate it. So just my experience, I came into this field, I don't know, just over 5 years ago. And as I came into the field as a counselor, brand new. And my director was great. She came from more industrial organized psych approach, very firm in, like her appearance. So she was, I'm not going to say strict, but she held herself to a certain standard. So she wanted to like know your competency. And as speaking of competency, she would help you grow. What theory can you use? How can you change your approach this way? So things like that. So I took that and I kind of incorporate that into my practice over the years. Where I'm at today, what I don't see, especially at my internship site, is that there's more like a laissez-faire approach. It's kind of like a fend for all between the supervisors. And you can see that like there's a lack of structure. There's a lack of communication. There's many things that they don't get to work on. So I bring this up to my supervisor and they're like, yeah, well, we should be doing this, but we don't. So they kind of got stuck and stagnant in a way. So part of my, I guess, project for school is we have to kind of like address the needs for the agency. So I'm addressing this as a needs for what should be brought up into the agency. So they're kind of working on these approaches, but someone mentioned before, there's kind of no one size fits all. So what I brought over the years, especially when it comes to coaching, is a parts approach. A part of a person may need this. So a part may need a psychodynamic, a part may need a CBT, a part may need the feminist. So it's incorporating all of that. So learning to include all of that, as that blended model per se, which is what I like.
Okay. And Carol, you said something that I also want to, you said many things that I'd love to underline, but I'm going to pick the one that I really think is a provocative thought for all of us to consider as well, which is you said that, you came into this field and you had a particular supervisor.
Yes.
And that supervisor influenced how you supervise.
Or will be, yes.
Or how you will be supervising. And the thing I'd like us all to consider is that if we've experienced supervision, and sometimes that has been a positive experience and a supportive experience, and other times it has maybe not been a positive experience and a supportive experience. I began, my social service career in 1991. And prior to that, not in social services, I also experienced supervision as well in different settings. But I am formed by all those prior supervisory experiences. And I know very specifically, probably one of the best supervisors I ever had, I have incorporated, similar to, I think, Carol, what you will do, I've incorporated a lot of how she supervised me into the foundation of how I supervise other people. So another thing that we can reflect on as supervisors is, what have we inherited from the supervision we had before, the supervision that we experienced? And how is that impacting us? Because maybe we had a terrible supervisor, and maybe we learned a lot of tremendously powerful lessons from a supervisor who did not really meet our needs. So there can be benefit in that too. Danielle, before I invite you to unmute, I just wanted to, go ahead, Danielle. I see that you put something in the chat. Go ahead.
So I was just going to comment that I also experienced similar, I've had really good supervision, and I've had and again, it wasn't bad supervision. It was more of a supervisor who said, well, Danielle, you're very independent and you're very knowledgeable. So it's like, well, just because I'm good at my job doesn't mean I don't still need supervision, right? So that's something that I've experienced. So I also try to bring that into my current supervision. But also what I commented in the chat is I address things in supervision. I always ask, if folks have any questions, worries, concerns, etc. But I do periodically do a SWOT analysis with staff to make sure that I'm seeing the same opportunities. If they see threats that I'm addressing, like, hey, funding's actually not an issue for you guys, don't need to worry about that, I need to worry about that. So I can sort of, put those, and then also looking at strengths and weaknesses of the programming and of the staffing, like maybe we need an agency-wide training, maybe we need just a staff training, etc. So I try to incorporate them in that process. And I also find that as a change agent in the organization, it helps me to make those changes because staff feel like they're a part of the process and they're being heard, even if it's not like, oh, well, you guys think that XYZ should happen. Maybe I can't always do that, but I hear you and I can validate that I've heard that. So even if the changes don't happen, they still feel heard and recognized and like they're an important part of the corporation. So that's what I've tried to incorporate in my own supervision. That was all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. And, you know, again, I want to underline what Danielle just said, that supervisees feel heard. Doesn't mean that we can always do or give them what they ask for, but what we can assure every supervisee, if we're engaging in a conversation with them, is that they are heard. Go ahead, Keith. What did you want to say?
Good morning.
Morning.
It's I'm listening in to the models that everyone's speaking about. It's become very fascinating because number one, I like the developmental model. As we speak about supervision, I remember a senior counselor. Well, he wasn't a senior counselor at the moment, but he's been in the field a long time. He used to give me insight into the field, give me tips on how to develop as being a young counselor growing up. So it was almost like he was like a supervisor to me as well. You know what I mean? Just because he's been in the field and he used to give me a lot of information. And when my supervisor, because we had a couple changes, came in, he knew him. And I once asked, I said, how is he? How is the supervisor? Right? And he said, the best thing I can do for you is allow you to learn him yourself. I don't want to give you any insight on how I feel about him. You have to learn your thing. And I say that, so I like the developmental model, but I want to comment on a few things about the family, the family, and then the young lady that spoke about coming into supervision and the supervisor saying you're very strong at certain things. I think when it comes to what she just spoke on, I remember when I came in and my supervisor, our organization was in flux and chaos, right? And what he needed was to not focus at the time on the counselor, the substance abuse counselors that were strong, and tried to get the other ones built up. So some of the ones that were strong at what they did, they came in and he said, okay, I'm gonna get back to you. I understand, and we're gonna talk about such and such, but I'm gonna get back to you because you're almost like a pillar, right? And I need to get to those people. So it started to make me realize, okay, not that I don't need supervision, but when you have a strength, the things that are happening within an organization, like you doing certain groups, needing you to put more, is because he's using you right now until he can pick others up. So when she spoke about sometimes needing that, I definitely understand the feeling, but sometimes it's a good thing that they're saying, because it could just be an organization could be in flux and it's like, hey, I need to fix that. And when it came to the family, it's funny because as a supervisee, I think in clinical supervision, my personal family is a microcosm of what's happening in the organization, right? So if I know it's not therapy, not family therapy, but the way clinical supervision for me was what do you see yourself academically, moving up in the field and things like that. And I think what's happening in my personal life plays a part in what's happening into the organization, as well as the professional family, right? So I might be in supervision as a supervisee, and what we're speaking on is professional family stuff that's happening. So other client, you know what I mean? So I think it can be. I don't say I would. I'm not familiar with it unless it was just happening and I just was unconscious. But I think it can be within the professional family of what, say the clinical team, right? And taking roles and stuff like that. So it was very fascinating to hear and people speak on those things.
Thank you so much, Keith. And the idea that I think one of the things that I walk away with from this, and this has been kind of a brief conversation, but the thing that I walk away from this brief conversation is the curiosity that you can have about something, and the possibility, Keith, you know, you're kind of focusing on the family piece of it and seeing how that could potentially apply in a situation and how that lens could have some application in a situation. And again, all we're saying in terms of the work that we're doing in this learning community is that these different models, these different lenses exist. They're there for your consideration and for your thought and sort of application when appropriate and if necessary. And if nothing else, you're just opening yourself up to the possibility that, you know, oh, that's not a lens I've really thought about or thought through. And because this is a learning community, you're having the opportunity to be able to do that. Keith, you want to add one more thing?
Just one more thing. It's
go right ahead. And I see that Dr. Blackwell is here, so we're going to turn things over to her in just a second. But go ahead.
It was we spoke about, there was a part of the learning community who spoke about like the role plays, and it just popped into my head.
Yes.
And it's funny because I think when we think of, sometimes we think of role play as like something that you all have to be you know, invested in. But I think there's parts that, for example, a lot of times I was critical of my supervisor, right? And I'm pretty sure people who've been critical of their supervisors. Imagine this: if we go into supervision, right, and the supervisor is one that uses role play, and the supervisor says, "You know what? We're going to do a role play, but you're going to be my supervisor. How would you handle me if I was the supervisor?" And a role play can switch, so you can, I guess, express certain things that you think you would do better, when it's actually what you're asking them to do better. Like, you know what I mean? So yeah. I think role play, a reversal in role play might be, if done correctly, might be very useful as well.
Understood. And you know, Keith, you didn't say this, but that's actually kind of a backdoor way of modeling for your supervisor how you want to be supervised. So, and again, you know, Max elaborated in the chat about their supervisor and their supervisor's use of role play. And Max, it was not lost on me that your last line was, and it's horrifying. So again, having the opportunity, if I had the opportunity to be any of your supervisors, I would want to know sort of where you sat around these things so that I could figure out what would be best as a way of interacting with you. Now, I did pose a question that I'm going to let you ponder a little bit longer, and we'll come to this question either later today or maybe not until day 3, but that idea of what is the difference between clinical supervision and therapy. So we're going to leave that question in the air at the moment, and we're going to make a transition to Dr. Blackwell, who is going to be talking within the learning community with all of us and around the idea of the therapeutic alliance, or the supervisory alliance, not the therapeutic alliance. And it's interesting, you could almost substitute, but again, I let that question hang in the air for us to return to later. And we're going to focus on the supervisory alliance. Good morning, Dr. Blackwell. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. And good morning, Paul. And this sounds like this conversation is directly connected to the supervisory alliance. How supervisors are seen, how we experience them, how we would like for folks to experience us as supervisors, whether currently or in the future. All of this kind of comes under that thought process around the supervisory alliance. The other thing I wanted to connect as I'm connecting the bridge is Paul made a statement around, or he asked a question, which is something that we consistently have to revisit, not just for the purposes of this training to continue to ponder that, but also as supervisors or future supervisors. And what is the difference between supervision and therapy. Because when we talk about the supervisory alliance, it can sometimes get murky if we're not clear about what is the difference between the two. And so we may lean into that just a bit, but I think that that's a lingering question that you need to consistently ask yourself, particularly when you're working with supervisees and personal issues are brought into this supervisory relationship. Let's say someone is going through personal challenges and they bring that into supervision, it can very easily lead into that murky territory. Okay, so those were two bridges. The last bridge I wanted to connect was also the statement that Paul made in moving and transitioning over to the conversation and the change in the discussion. He said therapeutic alliance, right? And so when we talk about the supervisory alliance, one of the things we need to connect that is the supervisory alliance and the parallel process. There is a parallel process between the supervisory alliance and the therapeutic alliance. The therapeutic alliance, of course, is between the counselor working with the client, consumer, etc. But the supervisory alliance is still a parallel process because it's between the supervisor and the supervisee. So many of the same tools that you would potentially utilize in working with a client, consumer, etc., are many of the same tools that we use to build a supervisory alliance. That's kind of the bridges that I want to kind of present. So I'm going to move us to module 3. And in module 3, what I'd like for folks to do is to turn to page 26. And there is something there called the self-assessment inventory. And the self-assessment inventory, and this is going to be a short exercise, so I wanted to kind of frame it in that context. The self-assessment inventory is really a Likert scale, which really asks a series of questions of whether or not you strongly agree or disagree, etc. And what I'd like for folks to do is to take a few minutes on their own, about 5 minutes, 5 to 6 minutes, to answer the self-assessment inventory just based upon your first response when you read the question. Not to necessarily lean into it, but your first response when you read it. Do you agree, disagree, etc.? Then what we're going to do is, rather than break it up into groups, I'm going to have a larger discussion around this. And that discussion will be we'll have about 10 minutes for that discussion. So I want to frame it in that context, because we do have a longer exercise or practice exercise at the end. And I want to make sure that we have enough time, or that folks have enough time to process the scenarios. So rather than meeting in a group, we'll do the individual self-assessment and then open the floor to some responses to their response to the assessment inventory. Is everyone clear about what we're doing? So we're going to take about 5 minutes for folks to process the self-assessment inventory. So that would put us around 10:20, and then we're going to process it as a larger group. Okay.
So people are answering these questions on their own, and then we're going to discuss it as a large group.
Yes.
Got it. So begin.
No, I think folks were beginning already. They were already like leaning in. This is like such an amazing group.
I didn't even need to say begin. All right. Now I'm going to be quiet so people can answer the question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to review the questions myself. So.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I love these questions.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all I'll say.
Okay. So before we move into processing the self-assessment inventory, I'm going to, of course, go introduce the module, which is module 3, the Supervisory Alliance, and our objectives for this particular module. Okay. So module 3, the learning objectives are to understand the value of an effective supervisory alliance, describe the concept of parallel process in relation to the supervisory alliance, identify key factors which strengthen or compromise the supervisory alliance, and recognize conflict in supervision and identify methods to minimize and resolve conflicts. Now, I always like to preface this particular module with the thought process that we will not be able to resolve every single conflict that we can come up with that can happen in the supervisory alliance or in our supervision, because there's no way that we possibly can. But what we're doing is hopefully providing some basic or some foundation tools or some foundation discussion around some of the key conflicts which can arise, okay? So before we move forward, let's process the self-assessment inventory that you're working on, okay? So I want to open it up to folk to respond to that. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and open it up for folks to respond on. Let me ask a couple of questions to lead the discussion versus, hey, just respond to this. One, I'd like to get a sense from folk, what surprised you about some of the questions, or what was a question that surprised you on the self-assessment inventory?
I think Keith is raising his hand.
Because I can't see his hand raised. Keith, please. You can feel free to unmute.
I literally raised my real hand, not a fake hand. That's why I probably.
Oh, okay. Thank you, because I'm like, I don't see the hand.
That's still your hand though, right, Keith?
Yeah. I would say, let me just click on it. The first question is interesting to me, and it's this: a positive and productive relationship between the supervisor and supervisee is essential if supervision is to be effective. And to ask that question is almost like to me, a duh. Like, if you don't have, like, how effective can it be if you guys are, I don't say at war with each other or not getting along? I know it's professional, it's supposed to be professional, but even like the best professionals, if there's a lot of discrepancies going on between the supervisor and supervisee, how long does it last? Maybe it can last for a bit, but like, how long does it last before someone's going to HR or something like that? So that even to ask that question is like, wow, either it's not going to last long or it just doesn't at all. So I guess that even to ask that question, it was like, to me, it was like a duh. Doesn't have to be a good relationship for it to be effective. So that was.
We're definitely going to lean into that a little further, because one of the things we need to think about with that parallel process is that, let's say, for example, we have a challenge with a client, right? Our responsibility with the client is to maybe potentially address that rupture. And sometimes we don't feel comfortable doing that. And so as supervisors, we have to, the thought process in being thoughtful around, as supervisors, if we recognize that there's a discrepancy or things are happening in that supervisory alliance, we now are in the role we actively have to, or actively should address, hey, I feel like there's an energy in the room, something's happening. How do we work through this? Or even the acknowledgement that the energy is there is a part of maintaining a supervisory alliance. Okay, so definitely. I see that Danielle, you have your hand raised.
As do Joyce and Carol.
I see Carol, yes.
And Joyce as well. Now Yvonne as well. And
yes.
Also Jacqueline.
Okay, so let's go. I'm gonna go, is it okay if I go with who I see on the screen first? So Danielle.
So I think the one question that I put a star next to it, which is why I bring this up, is it talks about, was number 2, to be socially involved with the supervisee who seems more like a colleague. So I think to me, it was more of like, well, what do you mean by that? Because I definitely I work in a very team-oriented environment. So I've been known to buy lunch for the team, to have more of a colleague type approach while acknowledging there's a hierarchy, while acknowledging, those types of things. So it's like, that's one thing versus, I mean, if you mean, am I inviting people over to my house? Not so much. So it's like, what is social? I guess that was my question of like, it depends what you mean by social, because while I would want it to be a team, there's certain kind of boundaries that I don't think are appropriate. So I guess that's just what stuck out to me.
Excellent. And that's, again, something that we're going to talk about further along in the module, the boundaries, what does that mean? And you mentioned something about colleagues. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. Let's get to Carol.
So I'm kind of the same boat as Danielle, but I had to put mine into context. So I train jujitsu, and it happens to be that she's not a supervisor, but a colleague does happen to train at the same academy as well. So now I'm not training with her, I'm also training with her son. So we have to put this into context as you're seeing me as training, as a partner, being close, choking you out, and in context of a supervisory role and as a colleague to learn to differentiate these two. Not an easy task at sometimes.
Absolutely. And we, depending upon where we're working, that is extended exponentially, because if we're working in a smaller community, those dual relationships can potentially happen. So it is being very thoughtful about how to manage that. Having a discussion around how it's going to be managed is also key as well. Okay, thank you. Joyce?
Hi, Dr. Blackwell. Yeah, I too was undecided about question number 2 because I have had a personal friend who also became a colleague. And I had to not even sponsor her, but I had to supervise her intermittently. So, I was amazed at how I was able to be very fair with her. We're still friends to this very day. In fact, we work in the same building today. We're in different apartments though, but that's a challenge. It's really a challenge because it depends on the spirit and growth of the other person and myself as well. So that was like, yeah, I didn't like that too much.
So that's also, again, circling back to having a real discussion around what that's going to look like. And I think one of our scenarios does focus on what happens when you become a supervisor to a colleague or peer, etc. So one of the scenarios do focus on that. But again, we'll do a very preliminary focus on some of these scenarios, but there are so many different ways that this can play out. What happens if that person applied for the same job and you're in that situation and they're feeling, like, hey, I should have received that promotion. There's all of these different things that happen. And so just really, being thoughtful around having the discussion, bringing it forward, having a discussion, how is this going to look? How is this going to impact our relationship is key, because the supervisory alliance, as we know, is a parallel process. Therapeutic alliance is something that we're building ongoing. And part of that is trust and honesty and really having those sometimes very difficult conversations. But thinking about, as a supervisor, is your task or is your thought process to maintain the supervisory alliance, or just kind of like, nope, I don't want to deal with that. Let it just kind of like stay in the air and not deal with it. Okay. I want to get to, I think, Jacqueline, you raised your hand.
Yeah, hi everybody. How y'all doing?
Hi.
So I kind of wanted to address that with Keith and everybody, because Keith was laughing when he said number 1. That was stuck out to me too. A positive and productive relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee is essential during supervision to be effective, and that is so true. I'm struggling right now with the supervisor and the supervisee. I've had a couple of supervisors. I've been at the same company for 9 years. And I've had good supervisors, and just like I took what I needed from my good supervisor and I throw away what I don't need from the one that's not so good. I'm pulling teeth to have supervision for one, and then that relationship and that supervisor alliance, it's tough just to have a conversation when it's not healthy. And it's not healthy. I mean, I went to the extent to go over her head and ask for the program director to supervise me for a while, because the relationship is like no delivery, don't know how to address like the conversation. So it's hard for me to even supervise my own staff if I have to bring my supervision to you. So my way of supervision is they give me what needs they want to be addressed on a piece of paper. So they give me what they need to address, and we go over that. But then I have to give that to my supervisor, and it's hard when it's time for me to go in for supervision when we don't have that good supervisor's relationship. And it's a struggle for me. And I've been under the supervisor for 2 years, and it's rough. But it doesn't affect me being a good supervisor, because I take that bad stuff from her that she's given, and I don't give it out to my staff. I use, and I inherited from my first supervisor that was good and effective. I took what was inputted me from him, and I used that, but I still remain professional, but it's just a work relationship. That's it. Keep it professional, work, get through the supervision. I don't even want to be in supervision, but I know I have to do it weekly. So I put some stuff on paper, surface, go in there, talk about what I need to be talked about. And it's really harmful to, I think, to me, because I can't address everything that I really want to address, because the trust is gone for one. It's some barriers there for two. And then the supervisor alignment is gone. Like, because you're critiquing everything I say. So, you know, I don't know, but it does have to be a healthy relationship. Or it's not effective to me or my clients or my the staff that's up under me.
Thank you so very much for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks,
because one of the keys, you know, one of the keys we also need to think about is we're in a supervisee or supervision training, clinical supervision training, and we're talking about you as supervisors or potential supervisors supervising your staff. But we also need to consider our supervision, right? And it's something that we consistently need to revisit, because we can put in the work around our supervision, how we supervise our staff, but we also need that same support as well. So one of the things I want to bring your attention to that it was sent out in the package is the supervisory competencies, right? There is, I think I always get the TAPs and the TIPs confused, so excuse me, but I think it's the TIP or the TAP 21A, which is the supervisory competencies. Taking a look at that. Also, there is a supervisory PDP, which is the professional development plan. While we won't discuss those are resources that you can potentially utilize in your supervision to help frame the supervision with your supervisor to help take some of that, I'm going to call it heat, out of that supervision. Okay, but you bring up a very, very important point, that as supervisors, we have to feel supported and cared for and have a supervisory alliance with our supervisors, okay? The recognition that not everyone has the necessary bandwidth or skills to provide appropriate supervision is something that we always need to consider. We have amazing supervisors that we take a lot of our skills, a lot of our strategies, and we utilize them. But even so-called challenging supervisors, or I'm going to use a harsh word, bad supervisors, we learn lessons from them as well. We learn what not to do. Okay, so you have the supervisors who, when you think about your own supervision, supervisors who were amazing and you have those skills and you're utilizing them, but our challenging supervisors, oh yeah, I'm not going to do that because I know how that felt to me, right? And so a part of the supervisory alliance is in many ways being empathic and remembering that you're trying to understand your supervisee as much as possible. And part of that is remembering when you were receiving supervision or currently receiving supervision, what was helpful and what was unhelpful. Okay, so there are lessons to consistently be learned throughout your professional development. I see some interesting stuff going in the chat, Paul. Is there something going there that I need to acknowledge?
No, it's mostly just me.
Okay. Okay. But again, this is ongoing. This is not the end all be all, but this is ongoing questions that you will ask yourself. But this self-assessment inventory is a great starting tool. When we think about evidence-based tools that you learn about throughout the training, this is one of those tools that you can utilize to think about your supervision or how you would like to supervise.
Dr. Blackwell, Yvonne also wanted to say something too.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Yvonne? Sure, really quick. I had the supervisor that was assigned to me. I didn't think she should be my supervisor because she knew enough. But you know what I had to do was I had to keep an open mind. So I went into supervision with her with an open mind, and you know we're doing really well together. We're doing good work, and as you were saying, Doctor, she's teaching me a lot so that when I become a supervisor, I can, you know, use some of her tools, you know, because a lot of times we have some things that we need to look at ourselves. You know, like I had a client that I had was not getting along with me for some reason, and I didn't want to say, okay, I'm done with this client, you know, can we put on another caseload? No, I actually had to take a good look at myself and say, okay, what's going on here? And I sat with the client and say, can we discuss, you know, our differences? And it worked out pretty well. You know, like what I'm looking at for myself after I complete this course, I'm going to be a supervisor. So I'm looking to see how I can be more open-minded and be more accepting. And, you know, so that also can, you know, when it says the first question about, you know, positive, it might not start off positive, but if we, you know, push through, it might work out to be positive.
And that speaks to the parallel process, because you also mentioned, as you were talking, what stuck out for me is you talked about going into, you had some potential preconceived notions about the supervisor, but kind of sitting with yourself and kind of thinking about, I need to be open-minded, and subsequently finding out like, okay, there's some good stuff here. Okay. You also mentioned a client as well, again, bringing us back to that parallel process. The same potential process that we have with clients, that I don't know if I'm going to be able to work with this client. I don't know if, and you can fill in the blanks of what I don't know if can mean, is the same way that we need to, or potentially look at the supervisory alliance. How are we, because it's bi-directional, it's a relationship. It's two people involved in the supervisory alliance, not just the supervisee has to come in and this is what the supervisee should do. It's us as supervisors thinking about, what's my role in this? If something's happening, if something has disrupted or caused a rupture in the alliance, before I go, I gotta go to HR. I need to let someone know. It's taking a moment and thinking about, wait a minute, what's my potential role in this? And really being honest and assessing your role and yourself, and maybe coming to a space, depending upon the situation, that I need to make some changes. Okay, so I'm going to circle back to something Paul said, and then I'm going to move us forward if that's okay. When Paul mentioned, or he asked the question about what is the difference between supervision and therapy, that is something that I have struggled with throughout my career, because I'm trained as a clinician and have put a lot of time and effort into expanding that training, and sometimes have had to catch myself like, wait a minute, I think I've crossed into therapy land here. Okay, and so it's a constant development. It's something that I constantly struggle with, but I also have to check myself and recognize that while I have a certain expectations of supervisee, I also have to check in with myself and say, wait a minute, I've crossed into therapy land, but stop this. Okay, and so again, all parallel process. Okay, all ongoing development.
Dr. Blackwell, can I add one thing before you go forward?
Sure.
And I wanted to touch on something that Yvonne said, because it really, it helped me to think of a question that I should ask myself as a supervisor. And I'm inspired by what Yvonne said, because like, why should a supervisee trust me until they've gotten to know me? Like, I can't, as the supervisor, assume that the supervisor is going to trust me just because I'm the supervisor. I'm part of that relationship, and I have to show that I'm trustworthy to that supervisee and to interact with them in a respectful, trustworthy manner. So I love your story, Yvonne, and I love the fact that I can ask myself that question and not just assume because I have that title or that role that this person's going to automatically walk in and be like, hey, you're my supervisor. I love it. You know, they're going to be like, so what do you got from me? You know? And that's not a bad question for a supervisee to be asking. So I love that you shared that story. Thank you.
Absolutely. And it's it just really lends itself to the next kind of piece that we're going to talk about is the trust, right? And I think that that is key. The same way a client walks in and we have to develop a relationship with a client is the same way that a supervisee develops a relationship with us as supervisors, right? And what are the key components? We can talk about all the different strategies and all of the different moving pieces, but at the end of the day, trust is a foundation of the supervisory alliance. If I come in and I speak to my supervisor, can I trust that that supervisor is going to hear my concerns, which is something Paul mentioned in the last module? Trust that the supervisor is going to be honest with me about what they can and cannot do, okay? And that I am going to be in a safe space, okay? That's one piece. Also, another piece that I wanted to chime in and also add to that is that we don't know what our supervisees' prior supervision has looked like, right? So we also need to take a step back and think about during the development of that supervisory alliance, one of the questions that we would ask is, okay, especially if it's a new supervisee, can you talk to me a little bit about what you feel comfortable with around your prior experience with supervision? Okay, because you'd be surprised, what you hear. And it also helps to guide how you can avoid some of the pitfalls in the development of your alliance with this supervisee. And so we're going to talk a little bit further about that. I'm going to move us forward so that we definitely have time to process some of the scenarios. And I see a lot of fun stuff in the chat, which again, just circling back, the chat is an opportunity to communicate with each other. And that's fine because that brings us, a closer learning community. Okay, so let me share my screen again. And don't feel, that this is a one-off. You can definitely, hold on one second. There we go. Can folks see my screen? Okay, so you can definitely continue to utilize the self-assessment inventory and at various points in your career. So this is your first exposure to it, but you can also, for those folks who are thinking about moving into supervision, you can utilize it. Supervisors now can utilize it. You can also, at different points of your career, go back to that self-assessment after you've been supervising folk for some time, or just reminding yourself of some of the key things that you need to think about as you assess your own supervision practice or your own supervisory practice, okay? Hold on one second. Okay, so we've actually talked about some of these things. What is an effective supervisory alliance? And what is the key thing that has kept coming up is a high level of trust. And we keep coming back to that parallel process. Clients trust us. Clients have a basic sense of trust for us. And what does that look like? But also the same thing. How do we build trust within our supervisory alliance with our supervisees? An effective supervisory alliance is also characterized by increased self-efficacy. Okay, what does that look like? Do folks feel like, I actually feel like I can engage in some problem solving and bring it to my supervision, and my supervisor is going to hear that process that I may have resolved that challenge and is going to hear me out and provide constructive feedback in regards to how I resolve that conflict, and provide some coaching if I need that coaching, and how I could potentially resolve that conflict or challenge in the future. Also, we think about an effective supervisory alliance, increase comfort. And this again goes back to that thought of building trust over time, okay? Recognizing that our supervisees have had prior experience with supervisors and what that looks like. And we don't just kind of, have that thought process. Supervisees are coming in, hey, let's have supervision. This is great. This is awesome, okay? Like recognizing that it is a relationship, and going back to what Paul mentioned at the beginning, a therapeutic alliance, a supervisory alliance, that parallel process, with the recognition that transference occurs within that. And our responsibility as the supervisor is to really lean into that and bring it out into the open, okay? And not necessarily think that the supervisee is always going to bring that to the table. Okay, so we have a responsibility, like if something's happening, address there's something in the air. It feels like we may have had some challenges here. I was wondering if you feel comfortable talking about that, and giving the supervisee space to say, I'm not comfortable right now to talk about that, and framing that in the context, okay, well, when at a later time, if you feel that level of comfort or you want to circle back to that, that is always something that we can do, okay? Higher level of motivation for growth, okay? We talk a lot about the alliance. We talk about wanting to engage in the professional development of our supervisee, but do we create a space for that? Okay, sometimes this is something that's outside of our control, depending upon the organization or agency we find ourselves. We're all in spaces where client care and concern is of key importance, but we also have to recognize that we do have to meet particular deliverables, right? And so sometimes we have to be very thoughtful about our focus on deliverables versus can we engage in the ongoing professional development of our supervisees, not just when we see a challenge, but if a supervisee talks about, I'd like to learn more about trauma-informed care, I'd like to learn more about CBT, etc., creating that space for that. So that high level of motivation for growth is really keying into your supervisees, recognizing what their professional development may look like to them, and then providing a space for that to happen. And that sometimes is very challenging in itself, because you may have folks who are like, you might see that they may make an amazing supervisor, but they are absolutely not interested in becoming a supervisor, right? But there are other opportunities for growth that may shift some of that thought process. We also want to think about an effective supervisory alliance also kind of embeds a greater satisfaction with the counselor role. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that in regards to the counselor role and satisfaction. What do you think? How do you think having a supervisory alliance kind of keys into that and builds that? Just wanted to open that up. I know that's a hard one, right?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So when we talk about a supervisory alliance and having hopefully a helpful and I say helpful, I'm going to leave it helpful supervisory alliance, it can be characterized by a greater satisfaction with the counselor role. The supervisee feels a greater satisfaction in their role. How do we as supervisors help to move that process along? Okay, I see that Joyce had raised her hand.
Yeah, and Danielle unmuted as well.
Thank you.
Yep.
So let's go to Joyce and then go to Danielle.
Okay, when I'm looking at this bullet, I'm thinking of the solution focus model. And I believe that in this instance, I would allow the counselor to verbalize what he or she thinks where their strengths are. I would focus in on them telling me what has worked for them, what's good for them. and what they feel they need improvement in. I would keep it on them so that they feel empowered in that moment of the alliance.
Absolutely. So that's using that personal model of supervision and really kind of using that as a tool to help build that counselor to feel like, you know what, I can do this. Okay. I think that was Joyce. Who else do I see?
Danielle, I think.
Danielle? Yes, Danielle.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Joyce was saying. I think the biggest thing that I've seen is just, again, being heard, right? So even if I can't make changes, acknowledging that something is a struggle for a supervisee, acknowledging that there are cases that are more difficult, acknowledging training needs, et cetera, whatever the issues that they're bringing to you are, I think is huge. There was something else I was going to say too, I think, but I think that's the biggest thing. It's just acknowledging that and really making it feel like there's a partnership and they're included in the conversation. I think a lot of times I've had, well, Danielle, what I want you to do is XYZ, or how we're going to do supervision is XYZ, versus saying, Danielle, what style works for you? Like what's worked for you? What didn't you like? What strengths do you see versus areas for opportunity and growth do you see? So when you frame it like that and they're invested in the conversation, they're invested in the relationship. So I think that's just been my experience thus far.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. And last but not least, we have improved counselor performance, right? So these are all aspects of the supervisory alliance, and your personal model of supervision helps to create the environment, but also connecting to the supervisee's needs. What they respond to is also a part of the supervisory alliance, okay? Because it's not just you, it's the supervisee. Okay, so building that relationship is key. And part of building that relationship is getting to know each other, what works, what doesn't work, and moving it forward. So it's creating an overall atmosphere of safety, okay? Very much like the therapeutic alliance. So it sounds like this group gets it, that some key tips for the supervisory alliance is establishing mutuality and collaboration, which is something I've heard about a couple of times. And I can almost imagine at the beginning in the prior module, you were talking about that as well, connecting that collaboration. It's not me telling the supervisee what they need to do, etc. That's a part of it, but the collaboration, bidirectional communication, we're in this together. The alliance is the two of us together, okay? Using self-disclosure to foster openness, honesty, and willingness to admit mistakes. Sometimes our supervisees believe, sometimes, that we've got it all pat. We have all of the answers, that we've never made mistakes, because we sometimes get caught up in these titles, right? Supervisees will think, you're the supervisor, you've got all the answers, okay? Or you've never made mistakes, or you're not going to admit that you made a mistake, etc. And sometimes the use of self-disclosure in a very thoughtful way opens up the fact like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize that. You know what? This may be a safe space for me to potentially talk about challenges I may be having in working with clients, challenges I may have with a particular policy, etc. And so, for example, I'm going to circle back to, I used self-disclosure a little while ago when I said that as a supervisor, whenever I've been in supervision spaces, one of the challenges I constantly have to work on is therapy versus supervision, right? And so when I admitted that, it feels like, you know what? I gotta think about that. And you know what? She's thinking about it, and she's also made mistakes, because how do we learn? Sometimes by the mistakes that we make. And I learned a very, very good lesson of moving from, you know, that alliance to therapy. So that's how I learned. I'm like, and again, admitting mistakes, there's nothing wrong with admitting mistakes. It opens the conversation up that supervisees feel like they can admit their mistakes. Okay. Yes, Paul.
Would it be okay if I commented on something that you said?
Sure.
You know, you really inspired me to want to say this, and I'm very curious as to what the learning communities and your reaction is to it. But based on what you said, and I couldn't agree with you, and I've shared your experience in regard to that in terms of my own mistakes that I've made in supervision, providing supervision. But it really reminds me that supervisors are grown, they're not born. I don't know if anyone is truly born a supervisor. I mean, you know, you may have certain capacities but I totally think that supervisors are grown, and they're often grown through the dents of their experience. You know, as you kind of work your way and continue your professional and personal growth as a supervisor, you have experiences that shape and refine how you do what you do. And that requires, you know, the paint being scratched and the car getting dented in some situations.
I love that metaphor, the paint getting scratched and the car being dented. You know, it just is. And if this feels very much like, I get it, that I'm glad that you feel that, but also the thought process is this is an environment. There is no set way to build a supervisory alliance, because no one strategy that you use is going to be helpful across every single supervisee. If you have multiple supervisee, building an alliance with one supervisee may look very different than building an alliance with another. But it's building an atmosphere where folks feel like I can come in, I can feel a sense of safety, lack of judgment, that this is a safe space for me to talk about what's happening for me in my work with the clients, if I'm having some challenges, and I won't feel like the hammer is coming down, okay? Or I will be judged, or I will get into trouble, okay? I think that this is an ongoing, you know, process. It's not a one-off, it's consistent work, okay?
Yep.
We're also going to talk openly, or tips for also building an effective supervisory alliance is talking openly about the hierarchy of power and the means available to resolve problems. Again, as I came into the conversation, it sounded like that was already discussed, right? What can you do as a supervisor and what you can't do, okay? I think, Paul, we mentioned it earlier in the training, the first day, when we talked about many times clinical supervisors are in the middle. They have to manage the concerns of the higher ups and with the counselors and line staff. And so what can you do? What can you not do? Openly talking about it and really saying, you know what, that's something I need to take to my supervisor. That might be a larger organizational issue that we can take a look at, and saying that versus, you know, just letting it stay in the air, but also hearing the concern, hearing it fully, and then recognizing I can do something about this. And whatever that is, whether it's taking it up further, whether it's not something that we, you know, can put a focus on or make a priority right now, but hearing it is key. Okay. Same thing with our clients. They may have a goal, right? That they have multiple goals, and it's helping to prioritize what we can do and what we can't do together in our work. Okay. Also include the supervisee in setting goals and planning and evaluation process. So here's the thing. If you conduct consistent supervision, if that supervision has been a mutual collaboration, bi-directional communication, if working with the supervisee to set goals for their professional development, working with the supervisee in regards to setting goals around challenges that they may be having in their day-to-day practice, all of those will build hopefully a successful supervisory alliance. If our supervisees don't feel that collaboration, if we don't work with our supervisees around setting goals and planning and their own evaluation, right? If we don't do that work, what happens? And feel free to unmute if you wanted to answer. And if you don't want to answer, that's fine too.
The clients suffer.
Right. Right. The clients suffer. And again, we circle back to that parallel process. What happens when we don't do this with our clients? There's a potential lack of investment in moving the work forward.
Dion Berg mentioned no progress. Thomas mentioned lack of trust. Megan also mentioned lack of trust.
Absolutely.
Sam says disconnection, loss to contact.
Right. And loss to contact for a supervisee is potentially ducking supervision, right? They always seem to have some challenges around the supervision, not making supervision, or being in the supervision and feeling very much yes, no responses to questions, those types of things. So disconnection looks different in supervision versus our work with clients, and can some ways look very similar as well. Okay, someone can be present but not be present. Okay. Paul, you holding something up?
I am. My dog came into my office. Yes.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, oh my gosh, gotta give doggy props. I love dogs.
He's a good dog.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. So we've talked about what a helpful and hopefully responsive supervisory alliance looks like. We now kind of need to lean into some of the challenges that can come up with working with supervisees, right? And I think some of this conversation has already happened when we were talking a little earlier about supervision, okay? So we're gonna lean into that a bit. And so some of the challenges that we can potentially have are boundary and dual relationships. I think that was talked about before. Power and authority, interpersonal processes, the relationships, okay? Conflicts with supervisees, right? Supervisee resistance, okay? And let's be very thoughtful about our language, resistance, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because are we talking about true resistance and what that looks like, or are we talking about someone reacting to something that's happening, okay? Which would be a normal potential response, okay? And supervisor resistance, okay? Because we're talking about two human beings engaged in a relationship and building an alliance with each other, okay? And each of us, still that parallel process, brings ourselves into that room, brings ourselves into that alliance. And so the same way we talk about a supervisee is the same thing we need to think about when we talk about a supervisor. Okay, so those are some of the challenges that we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into. And so what's going to happen now is I'm going to break it up into 5 groups, 5 spaces. And what you're going to do is look at, let me see. Hold on one second. There are 5 scenarios located in your participant workbook. Okay, they're located on pages 27 to 29 in your participant workbook. And what we're going to do is break you up into 5 learning or smaller learning spaces, and you will each be assigned 1 scenario on which you'll process, okay? So you'll process that 1 scenario in the learning space, and what hopefully will happen is there will be a volunteer who will report back the conversation that was had in the breakout rooms in regards to reacting to that scenario. One thing I want to remind folks is that you have limited information in the scenario, so you're responding to the scenario, okay? But they are definitely keying into some of the supervisory challenges that we may have. So we're going to do about maybe 20 minutes with this, about 20 minutes, okay? So just being thoughtful around the time frame and also having someone to report back when we come back to the larger group. Clyde, can we do 5 groups, please? And as we're doing the groups, each group will have 1 scenario. So group 1 will have scenario number 1, group 2 will have scenario number 2, and so forth. Okay, so if you're in group 5, you'll have scenario number 5. Okay. Any questions as we're putting together the breakout rooms?
And Dr. Blackwell, you said 20 minutes, yes?
Yes, 20 minutes.
I'm ready.
Oh,
Yep.
you
Oh,
ready?
he's ready.
Okay,
Perfect.
awesome. Okay, so please remember which breakout room you're in. And also, please remember you're working on just the scenario that coincides with your breakout group. So if you're in group 1, scenario number 1, okay? And you'll receive a timer to let you know. We'll start breaking it down and letting you know as you get closer to the 20-minute time frame, okay?
So maybe a warning at 5 minutes and a warning at 2. And
Yes.
Clyde,
Will do.
would you? Yep. Okay. Thank you so much, Clyde.
Okay, so we're ready to go. And I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, folks, as you're coming in. Welcome back, welcome back. It seems like, let me close out this. It seems like, has everyone returned? Awesome sauce. It looks like folks have returned. Okay. So what we're going to do to move forward is I'm going to read each scenario, and the person who was vote elected, I'm going to say vote elected or vote and told to be the report person, will be the person who reports out on the questions. So I'm going to read the scenario, then post the questions for everyone else in the larger group to see, and then the reporter will report out on the group's responses to the questions. Okay? So I'm going to share my screen. Our first scenario, scenario 1, which is something we touched on in earlier module discussion, is boundary issues. So you are now supervising someone you were close to as a peer. The questions are, what are the advantages and disadvantages? What are potential problems and how would you manage it? And this is for group 1.
So we actually had peers who had both sides as a friendship with a supervisee as well as supervisor. So advantage that we talked about was because we have dual relationship, we already know their struggles. We already know their weakness and strength of their abilities, which could come in handy, or it could be also a disadvantage in a way. Another thing that we talked about is that alliance is already there, whether it was a friendship or whether it was a professional relationship, alliance is already there. The disadvantage of the issues were resistance. Because we were friends or coworkers prior to this new relationship, this person might think that, you should know, like, why are you asking me this question? You know me as a friend. So like, who are you to tell me, you're lagging this way? One of the example that we actually used was writing a note. When someone's really, behind their notes, it is important for a supervisor to, in a way, bring that in a supervision and be like, hey, your note is like, a week late, like what's going on? And supervisee would say like, well, you know how hard this work is. We don't have time to write notes. So like, you were in the shoes like 2 days ago. So it's like, why are you bringing that up? So that was something that we talked about. And potential problem would be a power struggle. Because of the relationship, we're like, well, like, who are you? Like, what are you doing? And also we talked about was a shifting gear from a friendship to a supervisor and supervisee relationship would be a potential problem between dual relationship. How would you manage it? We discussed that actually having a discussion of expectation prior to becoming the supervisory role. The one thing that we actually said was between 8 and 4:30, I'm your supervisor. After 4:30, I might be your friend. So whatever the issue we might have had during work hour, let's not bring it into our friendship, vice versa. And learn to wear a different hat, right? Like right now, again, between 8 and 4:30, I'm a newer supervisor. This is my supervisor hat. And 4:30 and on, we're friends. So it's a different hat. Another thing that we said was our own supervision with our director or our supervisor to discuss, what are some of the issues? What can we do to make this better? What can we do to, rectify some issues? The last thing that we actually talked about was using all the models that we talked about in the beginning of the, so using all the models to see what's going to work better to manage this, struggles or boundary issues. And that's what we discussed.
Excellent. 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 So it sounds like very fruitful discussion. And just to add on a few tips for managing boundary issues, we understand that dual relationships cannot always be avoided. And we talked a little bit about that a little earlier, right? That we have friends, we have folk that we may be supervising, etc. In a smaller community or in different communities, we may be working or seeing those folks in a different space. And so we can't always avoid them. But part of the challenge is raising the issue that the dual relationship exists. And I think Group 1 talked about that in really great detail. It's about actually talking about it. Okay, talking about it and having the conversation. As supervisors, a part of our responsibility to help to maintain that supervisory alliance is to actually address issues as they're coming up or just address challenges as they're coming up. Discussing the potential impacts to the relationship, to the peer, to the friendship, etc. Establishing agreements on how to proceed. Okay, what is that going to look like? And I think Group 1, you did an amazing job in talking about from 8:30 to 4:30, I'm your supervisor. And, let's kind of work together in that space so that it doesn't impact our friendship or relationship, etc. Okay, and having those agreements in place are key. Okay. Also, you may want to identify a mentor to discuss issues. Now, identifying a mentor to discuss issues, I think part of the discussion we had earlier around supervision, right? Your supervisor can be a primary person that you might want to discuss this with. But if that is not something that you feel comfortable with for a variety of different reasons, you can also identify other folks that you can potentially talk about potential boundary issues. If you have a strong HR department, you can use HR as consultant, right? And say, this is off the record. Doesn't mean that there's any problem or anything like that, but I just want to hear an outside kind of eye on what's happening, okay? So thank you for that. Amazing work, Group 1. And now we're going to move to Group 2, which was focused on scenario 2, which is power and authority. So the scenario is during the past year, because of staff turnover, the capacity to do periodic reviews has been mitigated. And I think we've all been in that situation. And you're preparing to conduct an annual review for a supervisee who is consistently late from our lunch break, late in his or her charting. 60% of his or her clients have dropped out in the first 30 days of care. And we know that retention is a key component in our ongoing work with clients. So the questions that Group 2 had were, what would be some of the examples of the supervisors overusing, abusing their power and authority? What might cause supervisors to underutilize their power and authority? 3, how will the fact that the supervisee's compensation package will be influenced or be influenced and impact the relationship? And 4, what are healthy guidelines for managing power and authority? So now we are moving on to Group 2. And who will be reporting out for Group 2?
So it was me, but I'll certainly invite my colleagues to go over anything I might have missed. So we sort of talked about 1 and 2 together.
That's fine.
So overuse of power, we talked about, hostility, so being hostile towards the supervisee when you may not have addressed some of those issues. We talked about just firing someone. So instead of, as the supervisor, instead of, talking about it, doing corrective action, you just use the authority to just fire them. For underutilizing, we talked about the fact that it didn't seem from the example that the issues had ever been addressed at all. And we weren't, again, we sort of added some information in different sections, or we sort of talked about the potential of maybe the person wasn't properly trained, maybe in light of the issues in the organization that they also aren't getting appropriate supervision. Or maybe they're not confident in their own supervisory skills for many of those reasons. And then we also talked about the fact that they really have the power to model appropriate behavior, and it doesn't sound like maybe that they're doing that. For number 3, we talked about the fact that had it been addressed before, because it didn't say in the example, I mean, it seems like it hadn't been addressed, but if not, like, how would you use that now? So maybe you haven't addressed it in whatever, 3 months, 6 months, etc. But now, because it's a performance review, now all these things are problems. We talked about, the issue of not wanting to be the bad guy and sort of personalizing when you're in a role with supervisees, considering, like, do they have children, do other things, like you wouldn't want to put them in a position where you'd have to fire them, but also recognizing that you need a certain amount of work and productivity. We also considered what could be the causes for it, because in the example, it talked about staff turnover. So, are they returning from lunch late today because they didn't get lunch yesterday? Are they returning from lunch late because they had to stop at the post office because they're working late every day? So what are the causes and conditions for that? And I think, or maybe do they have too many cases? Again, if there's a high turnover, so maybe they don't have actually enough time allotted to get through some of that work. Not to say that they should be coming back from lunch late, but still, considering those other things. And for number 4, we talked about how you could use the opportunity to ask the supervisee to evaluate themselves. How do you think you're doing? What are you seeing? And see if they recognize some of those things. We talked about corrective action plans in situations that require it, and a balance between, we sort of talked about balance in the role, but then we sort of mentioned, like, how supervision is a series of debits and credits, right? So it's like, what opportunities do I have to bring something to the table as the supervisor versus, because again, if once in a while you're 10 minutes late because you stopped to drop mail in the box, am I really going to give you a hard time about that if all of your work is up to par versus, if you're clearly not, living up to the role, as it sounds like in this example. And then we also talked about whether or not these things are properly documented. So is it a discussion amongst the supervisor and the supervisee of, listen, we evaluate that this is a problem, we appropriately document this. Again, so sort of going back to the CAP example, this contract between us that shows that you are acknowledging this, and maybe, changes in workload and other things as a result of finding out what some of those causes and conditions are. So group 2, did I capture everything, or if there's anything to add? So we had a really good discussion. So thanks to my group.
It sounds like it was a very robust discussion. And, you talked about some very, very key factors, and kind of thinking about it, when we think about managing power and authority, we want to inform the supervisee of the evaluative structure of the relationship. Okay. So one of the key things that I always look at the scenario about is that performance evaluations had been mitigated. They had not received a performance evaluation based upon the scenario. So your group talked about, do they know that these are challenges and things that were coming up for them? And did they receive proper training, et cetera? These are all things that we need to be very thoughtful about in maintaining the supervisory alliance, particularly when we're coming into working with a new supervisee, and we know that evaluations have not happened. We have to kind of set aside our assumptions that folks have been trained, set aside our assumptions that folks know the responsibilities, et cetera, and kind of start with a clean slate. Okay, so we inform supervisees of the evaluated structure of the relationship, that our, part of my responsibility is to evaluate the work that you're doing. Define the criteria for the evaluation, because if someone's never received a evaluation, they may not know the criteria. You may come across folks who have never received their job description. Okay, so really starting at those steps. Discuss the goals for supervision, and that's kind of framing out what supervision is and is not going to be, and empowering the supervisee to increase their decision-making abilities around how do they manage their lunch, how do they manage working with clients, etc. All of those things are a possibility in regards to managing power and authority, and using authority to give power to those being led. Okay, empowering staff, empowering your supervisees to feel like I do have some authority. I can make some choices in regards to how I develop solutions to address certain challenges. So for example, the retention issue, right? Retention is a big one. And so rather than this is what we're going to do, how can you work with the supervisee around looking at their caseload, thinking about what could be some potential challenges in regards to retaining clients, and how can they move forward in maybe addressing some of this, okay? So thank you for that.
Dr. Blackwell, as
Yes.
per your request, I just want to let you know it's 11:43.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yep.
Okay, so we're going to move to scenario 3, which is imagine yourself as a 45 to 50-year-old supervisor with a 28 to 30-year-old supervisee of the opposite sex. And so you're thinking about, this is interpersonal relationships, what potentially impacts the supervisory alliance? How might a supervisor abuse his or her power and authority because of an emotional response to the supervisee? What would your responses be if the supervisor and supervisee were same age, same gender, same age, different gender, same age, same gender, different sexual orientation? Group 3.
I got us for group 3. Kind of, I started off as just recognizing that it does feel like this was written from like a cis heteronormative perspective. So I do think there's some room for improvement there. But that being said, I think we still had a really great conversation around it, and talked about the impacts of just gender and age, but also we kind of expanded to other like intersectionalism that we thought all contributed to it, but it could impact how someone feels safe, how long it takes to make the supervisory alliance because of that, and trust. We also talked about like previous experiences, implicit and explicit bias, countertransference and transference, and our emotional response to that and how that might contribute. We also talked about specifically when we were looking at like age, how power and authority can be viewed depending on like your generation or what implicit biases that person may have about you, or you them. And we talked about another important piece we spoke on, I think a few of us said it in different ways actually, was more importantly than someone's like age and generation is whether or not they have, paid attention to or really been thoughtful about continuing education. So like somebody who maybe was in college 20 years ago compared to right now is going to be very different, and things are constantly changing. So more so kind of like the behaviors of someone that we recognize that, yes, like when you view somebody, intersectionalism absolutely matters. I think if like this question could have been better off with like more intersectionalism put in rather than just like gender and age. But I don't think we really talked about sexual orientation. We did talk about sexism and how that plays a role. And I mentioned like when I experience sexism, I call it transphobia, and kind of we talked about like microaggressions and things that happen in that nature. A lot of times, like I know a few of the folks expressed like how they felt kind of, I think as women is what I perceived as what they were talking about. And oftentimes, like for me, the reason why I call it transphobia is because even if I say I'm trans, a lot of folks perceive me as woman because I look feminine or cis-passing. And so I'll experience that in, like, we're experiencing the same thing, but in different ways, right? And so we kind of spent a little bit of time talking on that, about that being important when we're talking about like gender and power and authority. So we kind of talked about them separately and together, I guess.
Which is great. Which is great, because it really, you know, and just kind of acknowledging your thoughts around this particular question. We do talk we touch on potential implicit bias or potential bias later on in the training, but we do recognize that there are some aspects that do need to be expanded. So thank you very much for touching on that at the beginning.
And if I missed anything, please, folks, step in. I didn't write it down, so just trying to remember.
Sounds like another robust conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So just tips regarding the relationship, that supervisors need to be aware of feelings which may impact supervision, which I think your group touched upon quite well. Supervisors need to recognize clues and do self-examination and have their own supervision to process what is potentially happening. When relationship issues are more transparent, counselors may be more open to addressing difficulties, and that really helps to feed into the supervisory alliance where folks feel safe. It's like, let's talk about this, or I'm experiencing you this way. And so bringing that to the table. Counselors should be rewarded for raising relationship issues in supervision. And we talked a little bit about this, not just in regards to trust, but also having that sense of, you know, empathy and understanding that folks may not feel comfortable in doing that, but if they do, absolutely, we should address it. And it may be necessary to transfer supervisees. And that is something we'll talk a little bit later about in the latter part of the training, because it really keys into, can you set aside whatever may be happening for you so that it does not negatively impact the supervisory alliance? And if we need to, you know, expanding that conversation is sometimes we can't set aside things, because as human beings, we can't always set aside potential things that are happening for us. And so acknowledging that and recognizing that it can lead to a challenge or significant challenge in the supervisory alliance, and potentially maybe transferring supervisees. Okay. So we're going to move to scenario 4, and it's imagine yourself in a supervisory relationship where, one, the supervisor believes in empowering clients to take responsibility for their own recovery. The supervisee believes in providing guidance to help the client avoid making mistakes which interfere with their recovery. And so the conflict questions here are, how might these differences impact the supervisory relationship? 2, what are the special considerations the supervisor will have to give to establish a successful supervisory alliance? And 3, what guidelines would you suggest for managing these ideological differences? Group 4.
So we kind of imagine this as like almost like somebody newer to the substance abuse field who kind of wants to really hold the client's hands. You know, we use the example of, you know, when you first start and your boundaries are kind of blurry and you're like, you can call anytime you need, and until you get that first 4 a.m. call when, you know, the client is in need. And, you know, I think for the question 1 is, the supervisor really needs to like understand that they were there too once they were new, and like understand that want for hand holding and to really help, and that over eagerness to maybe step over a boundary to try to get things done. While setting those boundaries, which, you know, unfortunately, some of these lessons you have to kind of learn the hard way before, because, you know, everybody says, oh, don't, you know, make your hours open, don't do this, don't do that. And like when you first come in and you're like, I know more than that, and you kind of get yourself in trouble as a new green counselor.
And as
So-
a new supervisor.
Yeah, as a new supervisor too, you kind of get that like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing for a hot minute. And what are some special considerations supervisors will give to establish successful supervisory alliance? I would say, like, again, that strong boundaries, explain why those boundary rules exist and, what can happen, share, like, I learned the hard way, give them room to grow and room to make mistakes too, because some of these things you have to learn. Some of those hard lessons you have to learn when you overshare and somebody uses that against you, or you have that those things that we all learn about, that we all go in doing, and all these mistakes that we all make. You have to understand that's part of the learning process, and as a supervisor, giving us safe parameters to fail a little bit. And set those set strong boundaries, but a little wiggle room to figure out their own style and their own path. I think that kind of answers question 3 too, is just giving understanding and appreciating the want to impact, hand holding and empowering is a very fine line, and it could be both at the same time.
Absolutely.
And kind of saying, as long as the ethical and legal boundaries are maintained, kind of letting that go, because that comes down to preference.
Absolutely. Also sounding like an amazing discussion. So thank you for that. And just some few additional tips for managing conflict: open and frank discussions. And we've talked about this before. It's putting it out on the table and really addressing it, describing a satisfactory relationship, and identifying the steps to reach that satisfactory relationship. Also sharing goals to gauge similarities and differences, acknowledging the counselor's challenges, and recognizing and appreciating and understanding the counselor, and also recognizing that different folks feel different ways about particular challenges or things that are coming up. And so we can agree to disagree. Folks can have their opinion, but we want to make sure that that opinion is not potentially negatively impacting clients. And so figuring out and negotiating that within the supervisory relationship and the supervisory session is key. Okay. So thank you for that. Okay. Okay. So we have our last scenario is resistance, and being thoughtful about, when we say resistance, what that actually is. Okay. A supervisee's former supervisor was highly critical, directive, and constantly disappointed in the supervisee's performance. Now, in a new supervisory relationship, the supervisee is hesitant, afraid of criticism, of taking risks, and being observed. Even though the supervisee is achievement-oriented, there seems to be a strong feel of failure. The supervisor notices the resistance to supervision is trying to communicate that making mistakes and taking risks are a natural part of the learning process. And we touched on this earlier in regards to recognizing that supervisees have had their own prior supervision and supervision relationships, and what does that look like, and how that impacts your potential to build a supervisory alliance. And so the questions with this particular scenario is, what does a supervisor have to attend to in this situation to enhance the alliance? How can the supervisor reassure the supervisee? What would be the impact of having such a supervisee on the supervisor's expectation and how the relationship will develop? And what are some guidelines for managing resistant counselors? Group 5.
All right, it's me. I was voluntold. If anytime any of you guys want to jump in and add anything, feel free. We kind of felt that 1 and 2 kind of the questions rolled in together. So we felt that first and foremost, the supervisor needed to gain trust and provide a safe environment for the supervisee. They needed to be authentic, be encouraging and collaborative with the supervisee, and emphasize their strengths, and maybe even provide some self-disclosure and ensure them like, hey, you know, I've been in your situation. I know how you're feeling. Not every supervisor is the same, you know, it's not cookie cutter. Like things can change. I can be different for you. We can build a better, stronger relationship than maybe something you've had in the past. For 3, how would the needs of this type of supervisee impact the supervisor's expectations? We said maybe not necessarily lower the expectations, but redirect what your expectations are. So maybe rather than like hammering away on documentation, maybe focusing more on, like we said, like strengths or things that you're doing right. And then for number 4, what are some guidelines for managing resistant counselors, hand-holding, empowering, open door policy, like you can come and see me anytime, anything you need, I'm here, that type of thing, reassuring them, whatever you need, come see me.
Excellent. Excellent. So some
Anything you
additional
guys want to add?
tips. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just saying anything they wanted to add.
Sounds good. Sounds like an excellent conversation. All of the groups sound like you had an excellent conversations with the amount of information that you were given in the scenarios. So supervising the resistant counselor, first of all, avoiding labeling. When we say us resistant, what are we talking about here? Because I personally think that we use the word resistant too quickly. And so really thinking about what do we mean by, is this truly a resistant client? Oh, a resistant counselor, see that parallel process.
Yeah.
Yes. Avoiding power struggles. Is it more important to be heard or to get into this struggle around who is the supervisor and who is the supervisee? Okay. Those are things that can naturally inherent come up when we think that someone is being potentially resistant to our supervision. Reframe the information. So when talking about understanding, empathizing, etc., being thoughtful about reframing the information in that language. Emphasizing personal choice, which is something that will come up later on in next week when we do performance evaluation. Supervisees make choices across the board. We can do an amazing job in regards to providing supervision, but supervisees make choices, right? They can choose to follow through with our suggestions, follow through with directives, etc. That's across the board. So emphasizing personal choice is key. Recognizing the level of self-confidence, okay? You feeling self-confident within yourself, and eliciting self-motivating statements, okay? What does the supervisee or what can the supervisee kind of help to bring to the table to motivate themselves? Okay. Just being very thoughtful about that. It smacks a little bit of motivational interviewing, it sounds like, right? Just a little smidge. Just a smidge. So again, utilizing the skills that we utilize with clients are extremely helpful in working to build a successful supervisory alliance. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to move forward. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And what we're going to do is move to a 15-minute break. And after the 15-minute break, we're going to come back in and lean right into module 4 with Paul. Okay?
Have an excellent 15-minute break, folks. We'll see you in 15.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm seeing that folks are starting to come back. Thank you.
So I'm going to put something in the chat that I'd like everybody to have access to. And it is also in your workbook on page 34, but I wanted to put it in the chat so people would have it handy there as well. And you can ignore me. You're still on your break for 32 more seconds, so feel free to ignore that. We are back from our break. That was my segue to let you know that we're back from break. And I have the opportunity to spend the remainder of the time that we have together to talk with you about modalities of supervision. And we talked about models of supervision. We had a really robust conversation this morning about that, and we spent some time in the first day talking about that. We've also now really spent some time talking about the supervisory, and notice I'm making a very important point to say supervisory alliance as opposed to therapeutic alliance. We know that that's part of a parallel process, but specifically the supervisory alliance, the collaborative partnership, and I am referencing the MI model of supervision, a collaborative partnership that is developed between the supervisor and the supervisee. But now, not but, and now we are going to switch to talking a bit about modalities, ways of providing that particular supervision. So as we make that transition, there are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind. You'll notice I put those questions in the chat, 8 questions, and I'm going to ask you to keep those handy, either in your handbook as we go forward, because as supervisor, when we have the opportunity to work with a supervisee, we have to consider, yes, what is the best model of supervision in terms of foundation or theoretical orientation for the supervision? And we also need to think about what's the best modality for this person based on their particular needs. And those 8 questions that I've shared with you are questions that you can ask yourself when considering a supervisee as to what's the best modality of supervision for this particular person. And let's go a little deeper into what that actually means. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And you may remember these models that we talked about. And we know that people among us have sort of leanings toward one model or another and kind of aversions to maybe other ones, but these models exist. And these models can be delivered, provided to supervisees or a supervisee in various modalities. And those modalities basically are made up of 3 things: individual modalities, group modalities, and peer modalities. All of these modalities can be influenced by particular supervisory models, but these are basically the ways. And to my mind, what we've spent most of our time really reflecting on, at least at this point, and if you agree with this, type an A in the chat. If you think it's an overstatement, type an O, and I'm asking you for your honest opinion. If you would agree that we've predominantly focused on individual supervision, type an A in the chat. If you think that's an overstatement, type an O. But what I'd like you to consider is that there are these 3 so it seems that the people that have chimed in at this point agree with that we've really been talking a lot, and somebody's back. That's wonderful. Welcome back, Megan. Glad you're back. Hope you had a good break. So we've predominantly focused on individual supervision, and there is also the possibility of group supervision, and then there's also the possibility of peer supervision. So as we continue to think about our individual model of clinical supervision, meaning us as individual supervisors, we can also be thinking, and I think of Kim or Lisa, I can't remember exactly who it was who said this. I think it might be Lisa, that we want to have a big box of tools. And within, was it you, Lisa, who said that?
Yeah, that's one
okay.
of
All
my
right. I thought it was. Yeah. So we want to have thank you for confirming that. My memory was working. we want to have a big box of tools and tools that can be deployed in these different modalities. And again, we focus predominantly on individual, but there is group and there is peer as well. So keeping that in mind, these questions that have been shared with you, these 8 questions are going to be ways when you're thinking of a particular supervisee that you can think about what is the best method or modality. And the thing to keep in mind is that every modality has its pluses and its minuses. And you can see here with individual supervision, again, they're framing the objective very broadly as counselor professional development. That the frequency, and we want to be thinking about objective, frequency, structure, advantage, and disadvantage. But the frequency is that individual supervision can be time consuming, and it's also individualized, which means that the supervisor individualizes the supervision to that individual, which may take time. And then structuring, again, they're broadly conceptualizing that here as mentoring based on firsthand observation. And we are going to talk about observation as we go forward in this module. And then the advantage, it's tailored to individual needs. That's a great advantage. I would say there are probably many others, but that's a major one. And the disadvantage is that it's labor intensive. Group supervision, again, the objective can be, again, broadly conceived here. There are other objectives, but that it builds teams, it supports staff development, gives people an opportunity for skills practice. The frequency, it can be cost effective because you're dealing with more than one person. So you're maximizing your impact by dealing with more than one person at a time, and you can do it regularly. Structure 4 to 6 supervisees. They can engage in case review, in-service training, skills practice, sometimes referred to as role plays, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say skills practice here. Recording and feedback and sort of analysis of a person's practice, where let's say Christy did an audio recording, had written informed consent, did an audio recording of a conversation she had with one of her clients or patients. That could be played within a group supervision, and PS, that could also be done in individual supervision as well, but it could be played in a group supervision where Christy could receive feedback about that recording. Her strengths could be identified. There could be an opportunity for the group to analyze it. Advantage, again, if you have 4 to 6 people, you have 4 to 6 sort of bounties of experience and expertise within the context of the supervision, and you're providing supervision to 4 to 6 people at the same time. Again, saving time. Time is money. Disadvantages, may not meet everybody's needs. People may not want to work in that particular format. Christy may not feel comfortable with having an audio recording of hers used or video recording of hers used. So there can be, again, each modality has its pluses and its minuses. Peer supervision, again, objective. I love this idea of accountability to peers and personal development, personal/professional development, counselor development. But accountability to peers, meaning you're with a group of colleagues, therefore there's a certain accountability that you would be bringing to that moment. Again, the peer group determines how often they're going to do that. And sometimes the peers also self-manage it. I'll give you a concrete example. I am in the process of collaborating with another peer to create a peer practice group where myself and a group of other peers who are all members of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, we are going to meet once a month for a half a year, and we are going to be a peer supervision group where we're going to practice in role plays, believe it or not, we are going to practice motivational interviewing, and then we will receive supervision feedback, supervisory feedback from our peers. But again, we as peers are doing that together. Again, the structure of peer supervision can be one-on-one. Let's say you have an experienced counselor who a next natural step for them may be making a transition into being a supervisor, clinical supervisor. A peer supervisory model may be a great way for that person to develop their professional supervisory skills and to work collaboratively with a staff member who is maybe newer to the profession. Peer supervision can also be done in a group like the model that I just explained that I'm going to be engaging in. Again, you can review cases, you can use recorded sessions, and peer supervision groups are a great place, and we've actually built this into the MI practice group that I'm going to be in, where let's say Lisa and I were in that group together, and Lisa reads this great article that's relevant to our practice. She could say, hey, everybody, I found this article. I'm going to share it with everybody. Let's discuss this in our peer supervision group. So peer supervision group can be also a great place to share literature or any other resources that will support the development of one's skills. And PS, literature, i.e. articles, journal entries, any other sort of written information can also be used in individual supervision. Any of the modalities, you can use a lot of these things. Advantages, it's small groups, it's limited amount of time. Disadvantages, there can be history or conflict among peer members, and it can make significant difficulties to the point of barriers for a peer supervision group may not necessarily be indicated. So just wanted you to get a sense of that these modalities, individual, group, and peer, are all possibilities of ways of providing supervision. You have 4 case studies in your workbook on pages 36 and 37. And I'm going to ask somebody if they would be so kind as to locate the first scenario, which is Alex. It's on page 36. And if you locate that, and if you would let me know if you'd be willing to read it out loud to the group. Now you can follow along. Thank you, Danielle. You could, and Danielle, don't read it yet. But you can follow along in your book if you would like to read it yourself. But I'm going to ask, and Danielle has volunteered, I'm going to ask Danielle to read it out loud in just a moment. But the thing I'd like you to be thinking about as Danielle reads this out loud is the questions that I put in the chat. Because this particular person, Alex, in this particular scenario, I'd like you to be thinking critically yourself as a supervisor. If you were taking in this information about Alex, what modalities, because it could be one or it could be a couple, what modalities would you maybe test out with Alex to see if Alex was interested in participating in that kind of supervision? And again, you can use those questions, and let me just quickly review those questions. They're in the chat, and I'm going to put them in once more so they're close at hand, so you don't have to scroll through. But question number 1, is the counselor seeking credentialing that mandates a particular modality or number of hours of clinical supervision? Does the counselor have previous counseling experience? So where are they developmentally in their... Is the counselor working with an unfamiliar situation or particularly difficult case? Could other counselors benefit from the experience, growth, and learning of this counselor regarding a similar issue? Is the counselor part of a group of counselors or supervise a group of counselors you supervise that have similar needs? Okay, that already indicates a modality. And what group supervision benefit, would group supervision benefit every counselor in the group? That's a closed question, maybe with nuances. Has the counselor had considerable counseling experience and clinical supervision? And so are they in another developmental place in regard to their experience? And would this experienced counselor benefit from observing and collaborating with other experienced counselors? And that very specifically suggests a modality to me, right off the top of my head. So remember, folks, those three modalities that we're considering are individual, group, or specifically peer, which could be done one-on-one or in a peer group. Okay, so again, we're going to hear Alex's scenario read out loud, and I want you to be formulating what modality or modalities, because it could be more than one, would Alex potentially benefit from. So having said that, I will stop sharing my screen and let's hear the scenario.
Okay. Alex is a credentialed counselor who has worked at an outpatient agency for 4 years after receiving his associate's degree in human services with an emphasis on addiction counseling. He's a valued member of the treatment team and has consistently met the terms of his employment contract. He is now, together with other members of the clinical staff, preparing to implement a new cognitive behavioral clinical protocol for DUI offenders. The protocol includes teaching, group facilitation, and skill building exercises with which he is not familiar.
Fantastic. And Danielle, could I ask you to read it one more time and just read it a little bit slower, but one more time? And again, folks, you're thinking of those 8 questions, you're thinking of the modalities, and what modality or modalities do you think Alex, this counselor who is going to engage in supervision, what modality or modalities of supervision do you think Alex would benefit from? And be able to say why you think that particular modality. And we're just testing it out here. Danielle, excellent. Thank you so much for being willing to read it again.
Alex is a credentialed counselor who has worked at an outpatient agency for 4 years after receiving his associate's degree in human services with an emphasis in addiction counseling. He's a valued member of the treatment team and has consistently met the terms of his employment contract. He is now, together with other members of the clinical staff, preparing to implement a new cognitive behavioral clinical protocol for DUI offenders. The protocol includes teaching, group facilitation, and skill building exercises with which he is not familiar.
Danielle, thank you. Super. So folks, before I invite anybody to talk about what modality, okay? When we think of models of clinical supervision, does anybody get in any thought about any particular model of supervision that might jump to mind that might be helpful for Alex? And if you do, unmute and just throw it out there. But does any model of supervision kind of present itself to you? Because I want you to be thinking models and modalities, but we're focusing mostly on modalities right now. But is there any particular model? Because I'll tell you, when Danielle read it the second time, a very specific model of supervision jumped out to me. And I'm wondering if it did to anybody else. Did anybody get a sense? Yeah, go ahead, Christina. What do you think?
The integrated developmental model that acknowledges that the counselor goes through different stages of growth in the professional development. He's learning new ways. It sounds like he just graduated from college, doesn't have a lot of experience, and is trying to learn new things. So it's about understanding what he needs to in order to develop as a counselor.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Christina. Keith, did you want to add something? And by the way, Kimberly wrote in the chat competency-based, but yeah, go ahead, Keith.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I thought developmental, because even though he's been there for 4 years and he's been excellent in his contract and stuff like that, because it's new. Maybe the supervisor, because they're implementing it now, doesn't mean that, because there's not a lot of information. Maybe the supervisor knows the way to teach those techniques and things that he doesn't know, or somebody on the clinical team, and it's like, this is how you do that using your great skill set that you already bring. Now this is something different. It's like when I was a counselor, I might have not known how to facilitate a smoking cessation group.
Yep.
Compared to a different group, you know what I mean? Just learning. So
fantastic. And you know something, I want to just say how thankful I am to be in a learning community with Christina and with Keith, because the one that jumped out to me at first was the same one that jumped out to Kimberly, which was the competency-based model. And I value so much what Christina and Keith said, because it helps me think even more about this particular supervisor and where they are in their development. And it doesn't mean I'm not doing a blended version of both. Because, and I thought of competency, I'll just, throw out my 2 cents. I thought of competency because they're being asked to do things that they don't have those skills yet. And they need to hit those benchmarks, those competencies in order to, and I could see a blend of developmental and competency working perfectly there. But what about modality? What do you think about modality? What modality of supervision or modalities might be good for Alex, and why? Anybody want to sort of unmute and say something about that? Kimberly says individual and peer. Kimberly, can you unmute? Would you be able to? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Sure, of course. I'm thinking individual, sort of kind of what you talked about a moment ago, that while what's at the forefront is the competency based, but still a blended approach, I'm thinking with individual, just to really kind of tap into one-on-one with Alice's needs to learn the material. He might need a certain structure and how we break down the different pieces of maybe the curriculum that might be offered that we need to facilitate, things like that. But then also peer, because there might be some colleagues that have facilitated a group like this before, or some iteration of this, and perhaps he can do individual and some peer supported training as well. So that was my thinking, to where he can mirror what's going on, hear it, see what he thinks, and then give some good feedback. So that's that strength building among peers, that you have someone learning a new skill. That was my thought.
Fantastic. And, I want to link what you said, Kimberly, to what Keith said a moment ago, because, Keith, I was thinking, let's say I'm Alex's supervisor, and let's say I don't have those particular skills, and it's possible I might not, right? So if I'm connecting him with peer supervision, if some of his peers do have those skills, then they're able to help him develop those competencies that I can only support in a very indirect way because I don't have those particular skills. So again, I could see that. Did anybody have any other thoughts other than individual? Yeah, go ahead. Yes, go ahead, Sharaya.
I actually think, regardless of the scenario, using all three is good practice. The employer that I work with right now, what we do, and all of the supervisors do this, is we have individual once a week, we have group or a clinical meeting once a month, and then we also we use motivational interviewing a lot. So we have an MI peer coaching group that's once a month as well, and everyone participates. And then we also have a separate group if you are a peer coach, like I'm a peer coach, so then I attend that group as well. So it's kind of like we're always utilizing all three of them. And I think that has really helped me develop quickly over the last few years. So to me, regardless of the scenario, I just think a blended approach works. That way you kind of cover all bases.
Beautifully said. And you make such a strong case for multimodal supervision. And the idea that those modes are blended. Now, does anybody want to take the con side of that and maybe say why like a multimodal might not necessarily? Jasmine, I see you shaking your head. Would you want to comment on that? And I really appreciate what Sharia is saying, because ideally, if the supervisee can benefit from all three of those and a blended model is possible within the context, fantastic. Go ahead, Jasmine. What? Because I saw you kind of going like,
yeah,
yeah. Go ahead.
I think it kind of takes me back to our first session where we kind of was learning the difference between like the peer support, the group support, the individual. So although it kind of like works with the dynamic that is in the environment they work in.
Yeah.
If I am, let's say, so like Alex is kind of he has a lot of 4 years is a lot of experience in our field, like hands-on, and then have like an associate's degree. Is kind of like newer, so his ideology is going to be fresher than someone who's been there for 20 years or so. So again, when I'm trying to learn something that someone else may already know or don't know, like putting them in a peer group can kind of almost be not so much what's the word I'm looking for? Not like offensive, but it can also be like a waste of time for, where I feel like I'm not benefiting from this or it's actually taken away more from me in that kind of aspect. So
thank you, Jasmine. And again, I love having what Sharia said right next to what Jasmine said, because that causes us as supervisors that we need to be intentional. We don't want to just sign everybody up for like all three modes. We want to be intentional. And again, we have to balance that with, what Sharia is saying, that maybe in the context of that setting, that is what is sort of standard practice. But as supervisors, we do have to consider, beautifully said, Jasmine, we have to consider what's going to be best for this particular unique individual. Okay? Now, understood. Thanks, Danielle. So what I want to let you know is that in your workbooks on page 36 and 37, there are 3 additional scenarios. And what I am going to ask you to do as kind of a mini or micro assignment is I'm going to ask you to look at those 3 scenarios. And just based on the conversation we've had, just based on what we've talked about now, based on your understanding, because you're the clinical supervisor in this case, based on your understanding of the scenario, what would you recommend as the mode, the modality, or the modalities for Hannah, Evan, and Delyn? Those are the 3 supervisees in the scenarios. So when we start back next time, we will look at those 3 scenarios. Okay? So I'm going to ask you to just review them. They're very brief. I'm going to ask you to review them, and I'm going to ask you to trust your gut instincts about what modality do you believe that person would be in, or modalities, because it could be more than one. All right? So I'm going to ask you to do that as preparation for our next conversation. The last thing that I'm going to cover with you today, and this will be, this will be something that we'll spend more time on as we go forward. But the last thing I want to cover with you today, I'm going to share my screen to do this, is I want us to be thinking about something that is considered a cornerstone of clinical supervision, and that is direct observation. And direct observation simply means that we are seeing what the work of the supervisee. That can be done in a number of ways. It can be done live, meaning that if Jasmine is my supervisor and I'm in a conversation with a client, Jasmine is in the room and she's observing me work with that particular client. Or it could mean that Jasmine and I are co-offering counseling to this particular person. Jasmine is also participating in the conversation, but again, she's there essentially to be viewing my practice that we're going to then discuss in whatever modality of supervision I'm receiving supervision. Okay? Then there's one-way mirror, where let's say I'm working with a client and Kimberly, my supervisor, is behind the mirror and she's watching me interact with this client. I know she's watching me interact with this client, and she's then going to engage with me about that. Or another permutation or variation on the one mirror supervision is that I'm wearing an audio device where Kimberly is able to say to me, hey, Paul, why don't you try reflecting back the client's feeling? And only I can hear that in my ear because I'm wearing the earpiece. The client can't hear it. But Kimberly is able to give me real-time feedback in the moment, and then we get to talk about it afterward. Okay? Then there are audio or video recordings that can be used during individual supervision, during group supervision, or peer supervision. Okay? The actual use of an audio recording or video recording. I have a lot of familiarity with the use of audio recordings within supervisory contexts and coaching contexts. But I want you to keep in mind that direct observation is probably and is foundationally one of the best ways to assure informed supervision. So, folks, I'm going to ask you to use the chat to respond to this. Is of these methods, sort of live, either you're being watched, or Jasmine and I are co-offering counseling, or one-way mirror where Kimberly is watching me or she's giving me suggestions, or audio or video recordings, I'm going to ask you to pick of these, which one of these would you be most open to? And type it in the chat. Which one of these would you personally, if you were the counselor, the supervisee, which one of these would you be most open to? And I'm going to ask you to just type that in the chat. Okay, audio, video, live. Okay, live. Okay. All right, excellent. Yeah, go ahead, please. Please, go ahead, please.
A funny question, because
go ahead, Keith. I love funny questions.
When I think of the direct observation, I think of as a counselor, if I know my supervisors watching me at that moment, depending, it doesn't matter if the observation.
Yep.
I think unconsciously I may act different, right? But if the supervisor stated, sometime this week, you go to clinical meeting sometime this week, yeah, all gonna be either have a one-way mirror, live, audio. Sometime this week it is random, and now I'm going into a fitting of this week of regular. I think that would be totally different, even though each scenario is actually different, like one-way live thing. I think just knowing, like, okay, this month or this and that, it makes you feel more regular, if that makes any sense.
It makes complete sense. And Keith, you're absolutely referring to what Max referred to when they were talking about role plays. That, like, my supervisor says to me, hey, let's do a role play. Well, it's going to be very hard for you to be authentic. So I can really appreciate Keith, and you and Max are both acknowledging the impact of direct observation. Yeah, go ahead, Jasmine. I see your hand is raised.
It's funny that Keith mentioned that, because, like, in my experience, I realized that the client also acts different as well. So I think it's like a benefit to it, as well as almost a nervous kind of thing to it. So, you know, we're both kind of nervous because there's someone else in the room. So we're both kind of on guard, and we're both kind of a little bit more conscious, which is beneficial because when we're more conscious, we're thinking about what we're saying versus maybe that normal interaction that we have. And it's kind of good to see how someone acts when someone else is in the room. I noticed that, like, when I have a caseload, my clients respond to me differently than they respond to my peers. And I'm like, you have to show the same kind of respect to, you know, the people I work with, because, you know, we're a team, even though they're not in charge of you directly, or they don't help you directly, but they're always available to you. So just kind of being able to show that there's like a balance and like kind of like a ecosystem, and that it's not just me and you against the world, because we work together, that you can, when I, in my absence, go to someone else, or listen to someone else's point of view too. So it's kind of funny that he mentioned that.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Yeah, go ahead, Yvonne.
So it's been my experience in the last couple of, I'm gonna say months. I've had an intern, she's getting her master's, and she's been in my office. And what I do is when the client comes in to do an individual session, I ask the client, do you mind if she sits in? And my experience has been that I'm a little bit more cautious than the client. The client does not care. The client is just expressing what's going on in their life. And, you know, so that's been my experience, that they don't really, but I'm more, you know, more cautious of, but she's, you know, they're not even like worried that she's in there. They're fine. I'm okay with her being there, and they just go on with their individual session.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you so much for framing that, is that this is my experience, because that's why we're here in the learning community, to understand your experience. Thank you so much. Yeah, Sharia, you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I agree with what everyone's saying about how your behavior can change depending on if like, you know, you're being watched, as well as like the other person. Something that I've seen the supervisor do in the past that I really, really loved is that I think can help in that, and also be able to observe, is she always made herself very present. So like her office was originally like upstairs by itself, and all of us worked downstairs in a counseling suite. So she would put herself in like the conference room, which was like in the middle of the counseling suite with the door open, like all the time, walking around in different offices, checking in on people. So it wasn't, she was observing us without like it being like, oh, I'm watching you, or this is recorded, or, you know, something like that. And it made it so like normalized to everyone that she was always around, whether it was the, you know, the folks working or the people receiving services. And so I think that kind of helped balance that out of like, you know, of course you might be a little bit extra if you know she's sitting in the conference room, but it was so regular that I think it like forced us to do that all the time. And then that's just like who we became, you know?
You know, thank you for putting it that way, because what you're really talking about, and sadly, I don't think this training really addresses this, but you just did. So I think it's really important to underline it, is building in a supportive cultural experience of supervision. And the presence of the supervisor and the normalizing of the presence of the supervisor is a great way to destigmatize it. And let's face it, there will be some anxiety. Observation can cause that. But if you're familiar with seeing the person already, chances are the anxiety may not be as much. So in the final few moments that we have together, I just want to throw out for you to consider, and you know what your mini sort of assignment is that I've asked you to consider, your mini learning activity, looking at Hannah, Evan, and Delynn, and we'll start our conversation with that next time. But I'd also like you to consider that one of the tasks sometimes of the clinical supervisor is to build enthusiasm about the engagement in direct observation. And that may seem like two absolutely opposing ideas, but that can be the work of the clinical supervisor sometimes, because due to the nature of the work that you're doing, due to the nature of the organization that you work with, due to the needs of the supervisee, direct observation, as I said, it's a cornerstone of clinical supervision. So I just like to throw out that our work sometimes is to help build enthusiasm with supervisees and build direct observation into the culture of supervision where we are. And the way that that can be done is by acknowledging that there is a rationale for why we're engaging in direct observation. We want to acknowledge that we're not imposing this just because, you know, we think it's a great idea. There are rational reasons. And what I can tell you is in the tip 52 resource on pages 20 through 24, there is a huge boatload of information as to thoughts, rationales, ideas behind direct observation. So I want to invite you to also consider looking at that. So we can present the rationale in the role of supervisor. We can present the rationale for why we're engaging in direct observation. We can help that person through a process of becoming comfortable with direct observation. We can also be very clear and specific with the person about how observations will be dealt with in supervisory sessions. And we can also, as the supervisor, volunteer to be the first person to either be recorded or observed through modeling. And again, for us as supervisors, that may bring up concerns. But we can take that risk as being a role model for our supervisees. And we can acknowledge that supervision, direct observation being a part of it, is a required condition of employment. And there's a way to have that conversation that's not confrontational. So I invite you to consider these 5 points, and depending on sort of how we configure our next day, we may be able to revisit this. So again, I just want to remind you, please take the time to look at the scenarios with Alex. Well, we've looked at Alex, but look at Hannah, Evan, and Delynn. We'll start our conversation with that. And that if you get an opportunity to look at the tip 52, pages 20 through 24, that's 4 pages, that it will talk a little bit about direct observation. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this particular moment. I know that we are just 1 moment before 1, but Dr. Blackwell, I want to invite you to make any final comments you want to make. And looking very forward to seeing everybody for day 3.
The only comment is that whatever it is that you're determining that you're doing as a supervisor, it's laying the foundation. It's not just a sudden introduction of something. It's about laying the foundation, talking about the rationale, and really presenting it in a way that folks feel like, your supervisees feel like they have input, that they can ask questions, and can talk about any concerns that they may have. So this happens through consistent supervision. It also is planning with intention, as Paul indicated, planning with intention that if direct observation has never happened before, how is that going to look?
Right.
And circling back to the steps that were discussed, the rationale, how it's going to be discussed in supervision, et cetera, all of those things are key. But ultimately, all of the practices that we've talked about thus far and will continue to talk about is about consistency. It's about having supervision consistently and really paying attention to that process as you move along. Okay. And a lot of this is also connected to supervisory alliance, because if you trust someone, when they come into the room to observe you, you don't feel that, or you feel less of that anxiety, because I know I can trust my supervisor.
Yeah. Folks, thank you so much. We'll look forward to see you on day 3. Take good care, and we'll see you soon.
Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye.
Hi, everybody.
Bye.